This is a fairly long story by my own account, but I encourage you to stick with me. So, a few years back, a 25-year-old female, boyfriend's dad's family decided to get together and all chip in to rent a condo in Ontario, Canada, for the purpose of getting the entire family together. There's a big extended family up there that his dad never really got a chance to see because he only really got along with one of his 3 sisters. My boyfriend's mom talked my boyfriend into going, and they let me tag along because I'd been around long enough that they liked me and trusted me. I can't remember where everyone else had gone. I think it was maybe to the beach for what was likely the 3rd time that day. At this point, it was just me and my boyfriend at the condo, because we were kind of sick of the beach and just wanted to do nothing in the shade for a while. We were sitting outside the house, looking over at the water, just sort of talking about life. At this point of the game, I fashioned myself as quite the nerd and a rather large child. So I had just finished reading the Harry Potter series, and I remember discussing that with my boyfriend for a bit, when all of a sudden, this woman ambles out of the brush beside the condo. Just for an idea, this condo was on about an acre of land, and it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. The front of the property was probably 70 feet from a dirt road that no one really traveled down, and there were some dense trees and brush that surrounded 3 sides of it. This woman comes out of the wooded area, and I immediately know that something wasn't right. She was limping. She only had on 1 sandal, and frankly, she looked like shit. She was pale, and her face was gaunt. She was really pretty, but overall she looked exhausted. The thing that immediately caught my attention, though, was her baby, who she was holding pretty tightly in her arms as she started to make her way towards us. I didn't really know what to do, but my boyfriend immediately sprung up and walked over to her to make sure that she was all right. I couldn't help but think of all these awful things that might happen. After spending so many hours hearing these horror stories on Reddit, I was just terrified that she'd do something. My guy is a lot more trusting than I am, though, and he's always had the first instinct of, what's the problem, and how can I help? He's never really assumed the bad in anybody. So this woman is there sobbing by the time she gets to the porch of the condo, and she looks like she's been through a war zone. She's shaking, hyperventilating, crying, and telling us that basically her boyfriend has been drunk for a while, and he's been getting worse and worse. Although as she's telling the story, it doesn't sound as if there was ever a time where her boyfriend wasn't abusive. He'd get pissed whenever she was focusing on the baby instead of him, and part of what pissed him off was the fact that the kid wasn't his. So it seemed like he didn't have a care at all for the baby. She told us how this time in particular, he was drunk and she was driving him home, all with the baby strapped in the back seat. While they were driving, this man was sent into a rage. He grabbed the baby's booster seat and tore it out of the car before he threw it out the window as they were driving. Luckily, while he was floundering at trying to release the seatbelt, she was able to free her baby from the latches. So as he wound up and flung the seat from the window, she slammed on the brakes, exited the car, and took off running with her child. While she said that she never looked back, she knew that he was chasing after her. Although because he was drunk, he was more than a step slow. It's at about this point that we hear yelling, and we turn and see this angry dude walking up to the condo, and she starts to lose it. Drunk and angry, this guy had followed her all the way to the house, and he was starting to walk up on us. He was doing his best to act as if he wasn't pissed, doing the whole, "Oh, you guys found her. Thanks so much. Baby, let's go home," kind of thing. But he was slurring his speech and not doing a great job at hiding his emotions. Now, my guy has always been a pacifist. Honestly, sometimes even a bit of a pushover. He's really non-confrontational and tries his best to find a way to talk stuff out and come to an agreement before doing anything rash. But before I could even formulate a thought, he's across the yard and approaching this belligerent guy. As much of a peace lover as he is, he's also pretty huge. He's built like a football player, 6'3", and at the time of this story, pushing nearly 240 pounds. I've known my boyfriend since we were 10, and at this time, we were 20, and we'd been dating for just over a year. I knew him better than anyone. He's never done anything like this before, but he goes up to the guy and says, "Not another step, dude." Drunk guy tries to walk around my boyfriend and goes, "No, it's okay. I'm just going to take her home." My boyfriend steps in front of him again, shakes his head, says, "You're drunk, so I'm going to pretend like maybe you didn't get what I just said, but don't come any closer." It's at this point that the guy stops trying to pretend, and he says something like, "You don't know what's going on. That's my girlfriend. I'm going to take her home." He tries rounding my boyfriend once more, and one more time my boyfriend blocks him and says, "Stop." Now, I've never heard this tone in his voice before, or since. It was scary. It wasn't him. The guy tried one more time before my boy finally put his hand up to his chest and pushed him back a bit, keeping his hand firmly placed on this man's pec. I'm telling you right now, you're not going anywhere near that girl or her child, so turn the fuck around and walk away. Drunk guy was maybe 5'6" on a good day, so when he looked up to threaten my boyfriend, he had looked like a child in comparison. He says something that I couldn't quite hear. My boyfriend said something back, and then the guy stared at him for a moment, almost as if he was deciding whether or not to do anything. My boyfriend finally pushed him away once more, and this time it made the guy stumble back. He then started pointing at me and the girl as he was saying something, before he turned around and began to walk away. I didn't learn till the next day, but the guy had told my boyfriend that he had a gun, that he was coming back, and that he'd kill him and I if we stopped him again. My boyfriend's response to this changes depending on who he's telling the story to. Originally, he told me that he told the guy that he'd feed him his own teeth, which made me laugh, because my boyfriend's a dork, and I'm pretty sure he got that line from a movie. Ever since then, the line that he tells everyone else is that he said, "I'll be waiting." The woman was sobbing. The baby was sobbing. And I was shaking because even though my boyfriend didn't throw any punches or anything like that, I could tell that he was ready to seriously hurt this guy if anything else happened. We called the police, and aside from making sure that the woman was okay, breathing, and safe, we just took her to her sister's place. We didn't really hear much from her after, but I know that my boyfriend sent her an email once or twice, and she's married now to someone else, and had another kid the last time that they spoke. Aside from this sketchy incident, I remember it being a really nice trip. We haven't made it back to Canada for a part 2 of this excursion, but my takeaway is that not all Canadians are nice. You never know who is going to stumble into your vacation rental, and you never know who you just might be helping out simply by being big, intimidating, and having a great heart. I love my guy. So I find myself here checking out similar stories, and figured I should share my own, just to see what other people's takes are, because to this day, I'm still baffled by this experience. Anyway, about 15 years ago, I was living in Austin, Texas, but had flown out to LA for the weekend. A few friends of mine put on a yearly music festival at a biker bar out around Joshua Tree. Just a relatively small thing, where most of the attendees are also musicians, and it seems like everyone knows each other. So we drink, heavily, for around 3 days or so. By the end of it, you tend to need at least a week to recover. So I was in the process of flying back to Texas, wildly hungover, miserable, and completely drained. I had a flight from LAX to Dallas, then a quick hop to Austin from there. I was seated by the window for my flight, on the left side of the plane where there are only 2 seats. Next to me, in the aisle seat, was a middle-aged woman. Totally unremarkable, just your average Texan mom. We made polite small talk for a few minutes into the flight, but I really felt like doing nothing, aside from curling up in a ball against the wall and doing my best to pass out. So shortly after takeoff, I put in my headphones and started watching a movie on my iPod. You remember those. Until I drifted off to sleep. Throughout the movie though, I thought that I noticed her trying to look over my shoulder and watch the movie too, before mumbling something like, "Oh great, just ignore me." This happened several times, but I convinced myself that I was just misreading her and the situation. Eventually, I noticed her furiously scribbling in the margins of a beat-up, leather-bound book. I kept peeking over at it, seeing that the entire book was filled with unintelligible chicken scratch in pretty much every bit of available space within the margins. I also noticed that it was an Alcoholics Anonymous book. Whatever, just someone with issues. Eventually, I was able to fall back asleep. Wake up just as we land in Dallas. People start getting off the plane. But aisle seat lady makes zero effort to start packing her things up or get ready to go. She keeps sitting there, scribbling in her book. As I said, I'm intensely hungover and kind of cranky. I have no patience for anything that's prolonging the time that I have to spend on an airplane. It gets to our row, and it's her turn to move into the aisle. But again, she doesn't move at all. The rows behind us now start to leave. I finally speak up. "Hey, I've got a connection to catch, so I have to get moving here," gesturing towards the aisle and standing up. She laughs, shakes her head, before looking up at me and saying, "Oh no, you aren't going anywhere." I was so confused by this. My mind wasn't at its sharpest that day. I responded with, "Oh, I assure you, I am going somewhere. I'm getting off this plane now." She shook her head once more and said, "But you promised you'd never leave me." Now, other people who are leaving the plane are looking at this exchange, just as baffled as I am. I make eye contact with a few of them, giving that, "Can you believe this?" type of look, before edging and shoving my way out of the row saying, "Nope, certainly didn't say that." As I edged past, she sighed and said, "Well, I guess I gotta go with you then." At which point she stands up behind me, leaving her purse, book, and all her belongings on the plane, before following me out. All through the tunnel and through the terminal and up the escalator, this woman is hot on my heels, grinning like a madwoman the entire time. I'm walking fast, but she's right on me. I didn't say anything at first, and my mind kept saying, why is this happening now, of all days? I just did not want to deal with whatever the hell breakdown this woman was having, not the way that I was feeling. I eventually get to the waiting area for the monorail to the next terminal, where my connecting flight is, and she sidles up right next to me, still grinning. At this point I say, "Alright, seriously, why are you following me like this?" Her response this time, "Because I love you, and you promised me you would never be apart from me." I chuckled nervously and looked around at all the strangers also waiting for the train, making sure that I had loudly announced, "No, I did not promise that. I have no idea who you are." The train arrives, I get on, and she obviously follows. Now she's trying to hold my hand. I'm moving around the monorail car, texting the girl that I was seeing at the time about what was going on, and how I'm actually kind of terrified by this woman. My phone was at 1% though, and died before I could get any sort of response. I was actually getting severely creeped out by this woman. Her eyes were completely vacant. There was just nothing but emptiness in that stare. It didn't seem as if she even blinked, coupled with her unnerving and unyielding grin. I was becoming sure that it was only a matter of time before she snapped and proceeded to stab me or shove me down an escalator or something. She's still grabbing at my hand and following me as I shove my way around the tiny train car. I announced to the other strangers, "I have no idea who this woman is. Can anyone get a hold of security?" But everyone responded with silence. Nobody else wanted to deal with this either. I felt like I was the crazy one now, making random statements to a train filled with strangers. We finally get to the other terminal. I nearly run to my gate, with her once again right behind me, still saying things like, "You can't get away from me this time." I get to the gate and spend a moment scanning the crowd. I see a woman in what looked like a police uniform waiting. I say, "Excuse me, are you security or police? See, this lady?" But she just shakes her head at me. It seems like everyone in the crowd just does their best to ignore us. You'd be amazed at how hard it is to find security or police in a damn airport these days. Finally, I make my way up to the desk and shamelessly interrupt the agent standing there. Doing my best to maintain my composure, I put on a half smile and explain to them, "Hey there, so this woman standing right next to me, I have no idea who she is, and she's been following me for quite some time." Both the agents laugh. The male one makes a comment like, "Oh, long vacation, huh? Haha. Seriously, what can I help you with?" The crazy woman laughed right along with them, rolling her eyes at my absurd assertion that I didn't know her. I chuckled, shook my head, and said again, "No, I mean it. I have no idea who this woman is." They finally saw the look of desperation in my eyes and the seriousness of my tone, and their smiles began to fade. They asked to see our boarding passes, so I handed in mine. She produced hers from her pocket as I continued explaining. This woman was on my previous flight. She even left her purse and all of her belongings on that plane. The agents speak with themselves off to the side for a moment, while I completely ignore this woman, just swatting away her hand as she tries to hold mine for the 100th time. The agents make a few quick, hushed calls, and then come back over and say, "Come with me." They immediately whisk me through the door and slam it on my pursuer, and I'm loaded onto the plane about 10 minutes before any other passenger, as a stream of staff filters by, each one offering a new apology. Eventually, the rest of the passengers get on the plane, and they all shoot me glances as they pass my row. Some of sympathy, some of sheer confusion. The man who sits behind me asks, "Hey man, what was that?" I gave him the brief version, and he tells me, "She had a complete and total meltdown the second you got on the plane. Screaming, tearing her hair out, pounding her feet. They took her away in handcuffs. You really didn't know her?" Nope, I didn't. To this day, I still wonder all the time what the hell was going on with that woman. I've barely even told any of my friends about this story, because even I find it unbelievable. I never received any other information about the incident, never learned who she was, or why she thought that I promised her anything, let alone eternal companionship and love. Even now, when I think about the look in her eyes when she said, "You promised me you'd never leave me," my skin crawls. Just so effing weird. So, I'm currently on a trip backpacking around Europe with my brother. I'm a 22-year-old female, he's a 23-year-old male, and we're currently in Paris. We're staying at this hostel, and we're in a 10-bunk bedroom. There was this one guy in the room who was immediately super weird with us. Like, as soon as we got settled. he begins talking to us about flying to Libya. He's all, "Us? Libya? Fly tomorrow." And me and my brother are just like, "Nah, dude, we're here in Paris for a reason." But he keeps saying it, and we keep saying no, although he's getting progressively more and more assertive about it. As me and my brother are going around doing sightseeing and stuff, I keep seeing this same guy around. When we're at the hostel, he followed us to and from the dining hall, out onto the terrace, and I find myself getting more and more creeped out with every visual of this man. My brother, ever the non-assertive soul that he is, does his best to laugh it off, as if this man is joking. This goes on for 2 days. Well, this morning, the start of the 3rd day, we're going out to breakfast and I happen to forget my phone back in the room. So I told my brother to go ahead and I'll just run back to get it. As I enter the room, creepy dude is just sitting there. There's no one else in the room, and I honestly contemplated just leaving my phone. But I didn't trust it alone in the room, so I planned to just grab it quickly. Earlier in the day, the guy was still on about Libya, and essentially woke us up by bending over our beds, going on and on about it, despite us repeatedly telling him to stop talking to us. I rush in, grab my phone, when he suddenly just yells, "Libya! Now! We go now!" I'm terrified, since at this point we're the only ones in the room. But through my own horror, I'm able to get the words out, "Fuck off, dude," before I go to leave. But he blocks the door and grabs my shoulders, still going on about going to the airport and flying off to Libya. Now, don't ask me where this next part came from, but I instinctively punched this man in the throat before pushing past him and running away to where my brother and I were going to breakfast. I decided that we were going to switch rooms at that point, because this dude was officially creep level 100. We make it back to the hostel, and before we talk to the front desk, we're standing outside having a smoke, and this man shows up once again. I all but yell at him to leave us alone, to which he flat out responds, "No." I head to the front desk and explain that this dude has been harassing us and that we wish to change rooms. I mention what went down in the room, and before I knew it, the cops had been called and I was giving a statement. As they were sorting it out, there were a couple of things that jumped out at me. 1. This guy didn't pay in advance. Normally, when you're staying in a hostel, you pay the full amount up front, or if you happen to be staying for a while, you'll pay weekly. But he was paying by the day. And 2, he had several pieces of identification in his wallet, but none of which matched his description. Apparently, Paris has been having a problem with human trafficking. This guy was escorted out of the hostel by police, and he was banned from staying there ever again. My brother and I were able to switch rooms, and we were given vouchers for free dinners for the rest of our stay, so all was not lost. But now, I find that I'm a bit terrified to go out by myself while I'm in a foreign country. I swear, if it had been me and that guy, alone in a more secluded place that didn't have cameras everywhere, I could have very easily been shipped off to Libya, a destination that sure as hell isn't on my itinerary. Hey guys, if you're into the content that we create, we've got a Patreon where you can support the show and get early access to new episodes before everyone else. Just head on over to patreon.com/Malevolent Mischief or check the link in the description and join our community today. This story is very unusual. It didn't necessarily happen to me, as it happened to my entire family. As a result, I've asked a few questions to place everything together. A bit of background is necessary. I've been in Canada for the majority of my life, but I was born in Iran, where I spent the first 8 years of my life. Also, it may be important to note that my dad had already gone to Canada to get things set up, i.e. get a house for us, land a job, all so that we could join him. In the meantime, it was just my mom, my two older but still teenage sisters, and me, the token man of the house. I don't recall this original incident, but since I figure the story will make the most sense chronologically, this is where we have to begin. My mom got a phone call one day. A woman told her that a document had arrived for her and that she should wait for it to be delivered. My mom obviously got excited. This was a time where we were working on immigrating to Canada, so she waited and waited and waited. No documents. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe someone was messing with her. Whatever. A few weeks later, in the middle of the night, my mom gets another phone call, and it's that same woman once again. She asked my mom if she was still waiting for the documents. My mom is still convinced that there was just a miscommunication, until the woman tells her, "Wait, I'm going to come over tonight," before hanging up the phone. I remember this particular evening because my mom freaked out, called some good family friends, who came over and spent the night with us. Ultimately, no woman showed up. My mom says that this lady called occasionally, once every couple of months or so, and whenever my mom asked her name, she would abruptly hang up. Fast forward, we've been in Canada for close to a decade. We're 2 continents and an ocean away. This incident is pretty much forgotten. Well, one day, the phone rings. My mom picks it up and begins talking to a Persian woman. This woman seems to know everyone in our family fairly well, asking how they all are, and things like that. My mom starts to wonder who she's talking to, but every time she speaks up, every time she asks, this woman just changes the subject. I don't know if my mom ever got a name out of this woman, but they ended up having a long conversation before hanging up, and my mom must have felt better about it. It was a pleasant phone call, so pleasant that this woman calls again the next day. My mom again has a long conversation with her, but she's slightly more annoyed now. She keeps pushing her for an actual identification, until this woman finally says, "Do you remember that time when I told you that I had some documents for you?" My mom suddenly realizes who she's talking to, and this only encourages her. By the end of the month, we were receiving dozens of phone calls at all hours of the day and night. Our house always had that ringing tune playing. We would have to resort to unplugging the phone, and when we'd plug it back in, as if on cue, it would ring once more. At first, if someone other than my mom answered, she would ask for her. After a while, though, and after a few abusive comments from me and my sisters, she wouldn't speak at all if anyone other than my mom picked up. It seems like eventually, she got bored though. And unfortunately, it wasn't the type of bored that we wished for. She started finding other numbers. She would call my aunts, my uncles, who were spread across 3 continents, as well as my dad's cell, my sister's work phone, and my brand new cell phone, whose number I had not given to anyone, let alone this psychotic bitch. Not only was she getting all these numbers, but she also had a lot of information about us. My mom may have encouraged things a bit, because she actually used this woman for news and gossip about the family. This woman knew more about my mom and my dad's families than my mom and dad even did. She also found a preferred target, my mom's mother. She would call her and have chats with her. One time, she pulled a similar prank on her. She told her that she wanted to go for a ride. When my grandmother looked out of her window, she claims that there was a car there. I don't know if I believe this, but this is a woman who has access to people in 4 or 5 different countries, and it doesn't seem like anyone really knows where she is. This story isn't really very chronological now that I think about it, so here are some even more odd events. My parents once took a trip to Iran to visit family. They wanted it to be a surprise, so they didn't tell anyone ahead of time, They were going to get a hotel room and then drop in on some family. Except when they got to the airport, my uncle was there to pick them up. When they inquired about how my uncle knew, he said that he had received a phone call saying that they were coming. Every house they visited on that trip got a phone call while they were there. More recently, my uncle, a different uncle, passed away. It was sudden, and my mom and her siblings decided that it would be better if they didn't tell my grandmother, who was living with us at this point. The news was not widespread immediately. My uncle's roommate had called my aunt, whose husband drove over and told my dad, who told my mom. Well, we get that trusty phone call, except this woman doesn't want to speak to my mom, but rather my grandmother. When my mom pushes her to tell us why, this woman says that she wants to tell her about her dead son. There was also a period of time where we would get a series of calls that were just white noise with a tinge of music in the background, or even people talking, as if someone dialed and placed the phone down on a table. This woman claims that that's not her, so either we had two people constantly calling us, or someone here is lying. As I realize that this story is slowly going nowhere fast, I'll try to provide something of a conclusion. Everyone ended up getting sick and tired of this, and one day they decided that something must be done. So they went to the police. This woman always called from blocked numbers, and the one time where her number wasn't blocked, it was using a calling card. Anyway, the police looked into it a bit and said that it was impossible to tell where she was calling from, and that we'd need to hire a private detective, which we weren't going to do. But since then, the calls have been fewer. I make a point of screening all calls now, and we often get callers that don't leave a message. But it's difficult to tell if they're her or just people who don't want to leave messages. I guess we'll find out how good she is by whether or not the calls increase after I post this. After all, if she could find my new cell phone number, finding my sparsely used Reddit account would probably be a cakewalk. What I'm about to share with you happened a few months back. I believe it was February, when my boyfriend and I had decided to try out an open relationship for a little while, for various reasons. We live separately in one of the larger cities in the north of Middle America, and there's a decently sized population of college students, like myself, to keep the gay community fresh. So I was doing pretty well for myself. One night, I was bored and scrolling through Grindr, looking for an easy hookup, when I got a message from a guy whose geolocation said that he was no more than 800 feet away from me. He wasn't terrible looking, and I was a little bit desperate, so I agreed to go to his place. He lives quite literally down the street from me. I can see his building from my window, so I walked over, and he let me up into his apartment. We made some small talk. I mentioned where I lived. Hell, I even pointed out my window from one of the windows in the stairwell. From the get, I thought there was something off about this guy. Not necessarily bad, just different. An odd twitch in his hands when he gripped the banister, the vacancy of his eyes when he smiled. I'm not so cliche as to say he felt evil or anything like that, but I wasn't exactly surprised that after we got to his apartment, the first thing he did was tell his very pretty and friendly cat to say hello. And the second thing he did was walk over to the kitchen counter, grab a needle, and shoot up. I hadn't even closed the door behind me at this point. I stood there staring, and he turned around, dropped the needle on the counter, and went, "Oh shit, man. I should have asked. You cool with that?" Now, I'm not a good Christian boy. I've broken into a church while tripping on LSD before. I had sex on a headstone back in high school. But I have my standards. So I shook my head mutely, pulled my hat back on, and stepped back outside the door to leave. The guy rushed over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Yo, I'm sorry, you don't gotta go. We don't have to do anything intimate. Do you want to watch Transformers 3 with me or something?" "Nope," I said bluntly, hustling away down the stairs. I bundled up my scarf against the early February chill and hurried back down the street to my apartment. But he followed me downstairs, barefoot, in pajama pants and a t-shirt, until I stepped outside into the whipping winds. I turned back briefly to look after a moment, and he was still standing there in the doorway, just watching me. I didn't have any premonitions of doom or weirdness. I grew up in Missouri. Junkies barely register as odd to me by this point, so I just went home and headed off to bed. Now, you might have guessed it, but I'd never seen this dude around the neighborhood before. Truthfully, I hadn't seen most of my neighbors because my neighborhood is an odd mixture of white-collar suburbia, college housing, and low-income housing, like my Paramore's building, all on a single street. So it didn't really register when I started seeing him more. I would leave for work in the afternoon, and he'd be on the other avenue across from my building, just strolling along. Or he'd cut across my building's parking lot like all the kids in the neighborhood did. A couple of times, I saw him walking across the campus mall. My apartment building is directly adjacent to my campus, but he'd always swerve to avoid me. Once or twice, I'd notice him in the grocery store that I work at as a barista, but it's the only one within walking distance, and he mentioned that he didn't have a car. This went on for the entire month of February. Eventually, I began to take notice. He'd always be walking down the street opposite my building when I left for work at my usual time, and he was only ever at the store when I was working. He'd never approach the coffee stand where I work, but he'd look directly at me. A couple of times, I noticed him enter, look at me, pretend to shop, and then leave without buying a thing. I was beginning to feel creeped out, but he hadn't done anything yet. Nothing to make me feel particularly unsafe. One day, late February, I was working an early shift. When I got off, I felt a little crazy from lack of sleep, and I got back to my place about 20 minutes before I'd usually be leaving for work. On the corner of the sidewalk opposite me was the guy. He was checking his watch over and over, in between looking up at my building. I did a bit of brilliant deductive analysis and followed his gaze up to my living room window. He looked right at me. There was this quick moment of tension as we stared right into each other's eyes. Like I said, the dude didn't give off any evil or dark vibes. I've met people that do. No, what I saw in this guy's eyes, in his face, was much more human and deeply more terrifying. Desperation, loneliness, pain, and anger. He hurried after me, but I'm tall, long-legged, a former sprinter, whereas he was a 5'8" junkie, wearing flip-flops on ice. I made it to the first set of doors to my apartment, scanned myself in through the second, and locked the doors behind me. He walked through the first, unlocked set, tried to open the second, tried pushing the handicap button to open them, before giving up. "Look, man, I'm sorry," he shouted, laying a hand on the glass of the door. "Do you think we can talk about it?" I shook my head. "Absolutely not. Leave me alone." Then I whirled on my heel, stomped over to the elevator, and when I turned back, he was gone out into the snow. I didn't see him for a couple of weeks afterward, which was nice, because my boyfriend likes to walk down the street past this dude's apartment when he stays over at my place and needs to go down to smoke. One night, my boyfriend was over at my place. He had just gone out to smoke before we went to bed, and he mentioned that he wanted me to come with him the next time that he went out. "Why?" I asked him, pulling him in close to me while he shivered. "It's dark and cold, and I get paranoid out there sometimes," he mumbled into my chest. "There's also this creepy dude that sometimes stands on the corner across the way, and he just stares at the building. One time he asked me for a cig, and I told him I didn't have one, when I literally was holding one in my hand. He laughed, kissed my chin, and promptly passed out. I laid there awake, troubled. When I was sure my boyfriend was deeply asleep, meaning after about 5 minutes had passed, I extricated myself and went to the window. It was a cold, clear night. I could see across the street under the orange glow of a streetlight. There he was. I couldn't make him out clearly, but when he saw me, he waved. I flipped him off, closed the blinds. I didn't feel like I should tell my boyfriend, because he was either going to immediately go to the police, which I hate doing, or he'd try and defend me. And while I love him with my entire heart, I don't want to watch a fight between a junkie stalker and my underweight, nicotine-addicted boyfriend. So I kept it to myself, and still haven't told him. But I did start accompanying him when he went out to smoke. This guy was usually outside. Sometimes he'd follow us for a bit, before ducking away down a side street. Sometimes he'd watch from a distance. Other times he'd be up in his apartment. My boyfriend never noticed. I kept my composure, and nothing happened. One night, though, we went out so my boyfriend could smoke, just like normal. When we'd reached the end of the street and turned back around, the stalker guy was behind us, maybe 30 or so feet back. I turned my head to check, and there he was. He waved at me again, and something told me that I needed to get back inside. "Hey babe," I said quietly to my boyfriend. "Let's get back. Yeah? I'm a bit cold." He acknowledged this by simply saying, "Okay, I'm almost done anyway." We walked back to the apartment building, and without turning, I knew that the stalker was behind us the entire time. I kept my hand intertwined with my boyfriend's, and kept up the casual conversation we'd been having about how I hate geese. We got back to my apartment, and he got changed for bed while I grabbed some water. So, I've never lived in an apartment before, and I don't know if it's odd or not, but this building has a wired telephone in each unit that rings when someone wants to be let in. Ours never rings, unless it's Uber Eats. So my boyfriend was surprised when it started ringing late that night, when neither of us had ordered anything. "Probably just some asshole playing a prank," I said, unhooking the phone from the wall and putting it in the kitchen cabinet. He accepted this rationale without a struggle, and we laid down in bed. After he was soundly out, I got up, got dressed, grabbed a few things, and then headed downstairs in my thick winter coat. Sure enough, my fanboy was out there, standing in the parking lot. He waved at me and jogged over, smiling broadly. "Hey man." "What do you want?" I said flatly. "Look, I feel like we ended things awkwardly last time, and I just wanted to talk to you." "So, you stalked me?" "What?" He started to look angrier, his brows furrowing. "No man, I didn't stalk you. I just wanted to know when I could talk to you, but you always avoid me. Now you're walking around here with that skinny little bitch boy trying to rub it in my face, and I don't fucking appreciate that." "Look man," he continued, smiling again and stepping closer. "You want to go talk about this back at my place? Ditch that little boy and come hang out with me tonight. Please? I won't shoot up or nothing this time." He took another step closer to me, and I saw in his right hand a dully gleaming piece of metal. In a moment, I noticed it as a folded up switchblade. He smiled at me, and I stepped back shaking my head. That smile drained away into a deep scowl. "Bitch, I'm done asking. You're gonna come over to my place now and finish what we started," he growled, unfolding the knife and pointing it at me. Like I said before, this dude was 5'8" tops, skinny. I'm 6'3", 200 pounds, and regularly lift. Also, I had a 12-inch kitchen knife, which I drew from my coat pocket and leveled at his throat. He looked at my knife, then back at his, smiled once more. Bro, I was just playing. We can just talk right here. Leave me and my boyfriend alone, I said very quietly, or I'll cut your face off and eat it. What the f***? It seemed like that part was an utterance that he didn't mean to let out. But that's when I said, I spent 8 years in juvie for stabbing a kid in middle school. Now, that was a lie. But he backed up, putting his knife back into his pocket. I took a step closer, holding my knife level. He backed away, quickly, almost falling on the ice, until he was full sprinting back to his place, and I was faux chasing him down with my knife, until he crossed the street and I stopped. I slid the knife back into my pocket, watched him run back into his building. Then I calmly went back to my bedroom, told my boyfriend I'd just gone to pee, and we both fell asleep peacefully. It seems like the quintessential thing to say here, that I never saw this guy again, and I hope not to. Nameless horny junkie, let's not meet again. Or I'll eat your face. I'm going to abstain from giving too much information because this stalker scares the absolute shit out of me. Thankfully, he doesn't understand English, so it may not make much of a difference if he ever hears this. Years ago, I moved to follow my boyfriend and to do a PhD in his country. I won't name the place, but it's an across the ocean type of deal. At first, I was very excited. It was a wonderful adventure. Until it wasn't. It's hard to describe the complexity of what I felt. I felt alone, misunderstood, far from my family and friends. And even though my boyfriend is wonderful, I really felt the weight of not finding any other human connection. This could explain why I acted so weird and disconnected from reality in the following story. I'm also a very naive woman, and I like to see the best in people around me. This has been problematic more than a few times, but this story is maybe the worst example of where this candid attitude got me. I'm just going to say this flat out. My boyfriend and I are into BDSM. We do it alone, on our own, and do not participate in events or anything like that. I do have an account on a known BDSM website though. I go there to find new ideas for our sessions, and I sometimes, although rarely, post pictures. No face, no tattoos, and I often wear wigs. I get contacted by interested doms once in a while, even though I clearly state that I'm not free. Usually they send copy-paste messages, so they're easily enough ignored. Once in a while though, I'd get a more personal message and make an effort to answer that I'm not interested and that I'm in a relationship. This is how my discussion with Nick started. He didn't approach me with a, "Will you be my sub?" but with curiosity about how I got into BDSM, stating that he was quite new to the domain and he was interested in understanding the way of life. So I gladly explained. Explanations turned into discussions. He told me he was in the police and that he investigated drug cartels. He also told me he was married, that he had kids. Interestingly, we had a lot of hobbies in common. A lot. I won't go into details about those hobbies, but they're rather specific. Feeling lonely, combined with the fact that I felt I could trust him because he was married and had kids, I accepted his invitation to start texting on WhatsApp. I want to be clear. My boyfriend knew about this from day one. Plus, we had been talking on this website for almost 3 months before switching to WhatsApp. He was very friendly and interested in my day-to-day life. He'd share pictures of his kids and of investigations he was working on. This went on for another 3 months. Then one day, he told me he had to interview a suspect close to the town where I lived and asked if we could meet up for coffee. I agreed, and we met in person for the first time. Before anyone panics, my boyfriend was off hiking with friends for a few weeks. I texted him, but he didn't have a signal. Plus, we have a very trusting relationship. He has a lot of female friends back in my country, and I hung out with a lot of guys. This isn't weird for us. But back to this first encounter. It felt as if we had known each other for years. We had a great time from the beginning, and I was so happy I'd found a friend so far from my country. He knew I loved reading thrillers and enjoyed murder investigation videos, so he showed me his gear: handcuffs, sampling kits for small investigations, other restraints, etc. It didn't feel weird at the moment, but afterwards, I kind of understood this could have been a way for him to show off what he could do. However, as the night went on, after grabbing drinks from a nearby bar, he forced me against a wall and kissed me. I was shocked, really, and barely managed to push him off of me. I told him that that was inappropriate, that he was married, and that I was in a relationship. He said that he was really sorry and felt ashamed of his act. He told me he felt that there was something between us, and I was like, yeah man, it's called friendship. I was disappointed when we parted ways. Days later, after he had apologized over and over again, he called me to meet up. He wanted to take me for a ride in his hometown. It's a pretty place. He's got a bike, and he wants me to enjoy the scenery in the country that I barely know. I agree to this. It's his hometown. He works there. He lives there with his wife and kids. Surely I'll be safe. But in short, I wasn't. Again, he kissed me, tried to push for more, in the middle of a park where he brought his children to play on the weekends. So that's when I told him to bring me back to the bus station so I could leave. He did without issue, then proceeded to tell me a story about how he had recently got a drug seller out of hiding by modifying text messages sent by his girlfriend. He basically made him believe she was cheating on him to get him to confront her, and then arrested him. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know if it's possible. But due to what had just happened, what I heard was, I can make your boyfriend believe you're cheating on him. At this point, my boyfriend was still on his hike. We would chat every few days, and I told him everything from the moment he had some cell signal. Meanwhile, I was confronting Nick about that. His behavior was really strange, as he went from, I'm sorry, I think I might be in love with you, to, if you tell the cops, who do you think they'll believe? Their colleague or some immigrant? I got scared and tried to cool things down with him. I just felt he could go crazy at any moment. He clearly wasn't used to girls refusing him. At that point, I thought it would be safer for me and my boyfriend to maintain contact with Nick, albeit with less enthusiasm than before. But after understanding how obsessed he was, I blocked him from all platforms where I knew he had an account. But nonetheless, he found me. He sent me my address, asking if I loved living in that particular part of town. I'd never given him my address. Now, I guess he could pull some strings at the station to get my info. He even came to visit me at my job. I was so scared that I just played along, as if everything was okay. I told him my boyfriend wanted me to cut ties with him because he was angry about what had happened, which was true. But I also wanted him out of my life. I didn't know how he would react if I told him though. Nick insisted that I loved him, that I could be his mistress, that my boyfriend didn't have to know. He was obsessed with me, and he didn't want to hide it anymore. He told me how he wanted to bed me, how we'd be a great couple, how we'd father our kids. He went from, I'll be husband material, to serial predator in a matter of seconds. I refused again and again, blocking him, changing my accounts. I got scared when I got calls from unknown numbers. I was terrified when I saw anyone slowing down on a motorcycle close to my apartment. I was wary of going outside and even going to my job. When the COVID quarantine hit, I welcomed it. Really. and I didn't hear from Nick for months. That's when I broke my cell phone. I knew I could transfer all my numbers from one phone to another, but I didn't know it would unblock previously blocked numbers. Days later, I got a message from him. He told me he had divorced his wife, that he still loved me, that he wanted to be with me. He apologized for making me believe I was only mistress material and that I was worth so much more. He said my boyfriend didn't love me, that I deserved better, that he was waiting for me. When he saw that I saw his message, he said, "Finally, I thought you'd never unblock me." Does this mean he had been sending this message over and over again in hopes that I would finally see it? That narcissistic man used all the manipulation tactics that he knew. He told me before we met in person how he had learned those skills to toy with criminals, to have them tell the truth and admit to crimes. Fortunately, I had dated manipulative men before, and I knew the signs. Basically, he wasn't used to not getting what he wanted. He was attractive, well off, interesting, and he knew that. I blocked him again, and we moved a few months later. I just hope that he doesn't get his hand on this information. I believe Nick's last move was trying to hack into my Instagram, as I got a notification that someone from his hometown had tried to connect to my account. We're now more than a little while removed from the last time I've heard from Nick, even longer since the last time I've seen him. But part of me still wonders, when I get the cold chill down my spine, if he's out there, closer than I know, still watching as I go about my life. I hope that's not the case. However, I wouldn't be surprised if it were. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of Southern Oregon. I'm a United States Air Force Security Forces airman, otherwise known as military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, who happens to be another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads to get out of the heat of town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days starting on roads that we knew, finding roads that we didn't, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off down a road that we had never been on and began the drive into the Cascades. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow itself was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table itself was rather odd. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get us a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scene was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked adjacent to the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. Now, I'm not a very tall guy, only about 5'7", and regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was staring at the table, Nick called me back over to the truck, and I noticed that he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. It was a small one-man tent, set back about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in that tent, and if we could see it, they likely could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested that I call out. I didn't want to, but I did anyway. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge at this point, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving the strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if the occupant of that tent was now deceased? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around and face away from the camp, pointed in the direction that we just came from, should we need to leave in a hurry. He would wait behind the wheel, while I'd go check out the tent. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was absolutely keyed up, with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. It was clear that no fire had been built near this campsite. No wood was collected, and there were backpacks scattered all over. The tent itself was literally full of backpacks, along with women's clothing. Still filled with an increasing amount of dread now, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. But as I left the tent, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go! Let's get the fuck out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt back into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The Taurus was occupied by 2 men. There was a third person laying against the window in the back. And as we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick deftly drove around them and accelerated the way that we had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that whoever that was would catch up to us, we hit the highway without seeing that car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was a male or female. We called the state police, sent them the location of our encounter, and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and all the women's clothing were gone, though he could easily tell that people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I can honestly say, in all of my explorations since this time, I've never returned to that area. And if I'm being honest, I don't intend to. The following account occurred roughly 12 years ago, during the summer of 2012. It's always been difficult for me to talk about, but I've ultimately found that sharing this event is rather therapeutic. I, a female and 17 at the time, had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural West Virginia, in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not too far from my house, one that had a general store to it, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months during summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s or early 50s if I had to guess. Huge, probably about 6'5" or 6'6", and had to be pushing 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered, and he had a long beard about him. We had a few of the woodsy hermit types in the area, and he definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't speak for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Toiletries and things like that? Yeah." "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly didn't know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items, and he paid with crumpled money. When, right before he left, he asked, "You cook too?" "Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys around here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. But I responded with nothing. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told my boss, Krista, about the bizarre encounter, and she just laughed it off. So did all of my family and friends. But then Mountain Man started turning up more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out he had a cabin in the woods, one that he claimed that he had built with his bare hands. He said that he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things that he bought at our store. Over time, our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make those things and cook his kills. One time, he even said that I had the burthen hips that men lust after. This made me shudder. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place. I always politely declined, but he got more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, to come and get her, and she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up. It was late, around 10 p.m. Krista had left about an hour before, leaving me alone at the shop. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup truck, as well as my car. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup, but I didn't see him in the lot, just his truck. So I quickly walked to my car, checked the back seat before I started her up. But then, when I first turned the key into my ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily, when just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. To this day, I'm still shocked that I didn't piss myself. I didn't even want to look up because I already knew it was him. But I did anyway, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth of his were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window, but I shook my head furiously. "My dad's on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad for years, and Mountain Man just laughed. "No, he's not. Just open the door." The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know that I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly. "You're good, just leave me alone." Suddenly, he looked angry. He pulled at the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle, and then started pounding on the window. "Leave now, or I'm calling the cops," was all I was able to scream. But this clearly wasn't getting the message to him. So I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I must have absolutely sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have officers out ASAP, but out here? That could be a while. "The cops are on their way. Just leave now," I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let it deter him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful that he would just leave me alone. But then he started walking back toward me, this time with a crowbar in his hand. Before I could scream anything more, he started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat, near the floorboards, and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I sat up and saw two men approaching, one holding a shotgun, trained dead on Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on their way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the cops, and surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away. The cops arrived shortly after I got out of the car, so he didn't have much of a chance anyway. They took him away, and I gave them my statement. All things told, I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the entire scoop on the guy. Apparently, Mountain Man had a history of mental illness. He'd been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods, where he wasn't taking his meds, and it seems as if his issues were only getting worse. I've got a cousin named Luke. He's a cop out here, and while we're not particularly close, it didn't take him long to hear that his baby cousin had been caught up in an incident. Later on, he told me some more about the case, things that he had heard about through some other officers. The police ultimately did a search of the cabin after the incident, just to see if there was anything that might be of interest to them. They found Mountain Man's journal. Apparently in it, he had said that he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name a lot, thanks to the stupid name tag that I was forced to wear at work. Luke said that there were a lot of lewd things in there about me, things that he didn't want to share. But putting it as simply as he could, he said that Mountain Man had a detailed plan on how to abduct me, starting with the sabotage of my car engine to put me into a vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears, thinking about just how horribly that night could have gone if those two guests hadn't come along. For better or for worse, Mountain Man didn't find his way to prison after this. But after the case wrapped up, he was reinserted into a state institution. And with any luck, he'll stay there for good. I don't reside in West Virginia anymore. So even if he made his way out, the chances of me running into that fellow are slim to none. But that doesn't make this memory any less prominent in my mind. I have always loved the outdoors. I was fortunate enough to be born in the Great Pacific Northwest, the Western Washington Cascades to be exact. My father and I spent much of my early years exploring the mountains, fishing, and hunting. There are parts of the Cascades I know like the back of my hand. One of those places is called Goblin Creek, up the Index Galima Road off of Highway 2. When I was a kid, we would drive up there to do some fishing and shooting, but also to collect a specific type of rock that when cut in half and polished would resemble a scenic picture of the view of the mountains from within a cave. I do not recall the true name of these stones. We just called them picture rocks. My father's friend and neighbor owned an art gallery / mineral shop that used to be a church. If you have ever driven through Startup on your way from Sultan to Gold Bar on Highway 2, you might remember seeing the robot sculpture outside the shop that my dad built. This is a place that we sold the stone for $2 a pound. It was lucrative revenue for a preteen. The walk from the creek where we harvested these rocks to the dirt road wasn't particularly long, but lengthy enough that you could presumably get lost while en route if one didn't know where they were going. In the years we spent at this creek, I had only ever seen two other people out there. One was a game warden that heard the gunshots from our target practicing session and tracked us down to make sure that everything was fine. The other is the subject of my curiosity. When I was about 14, I distinctly remember hauling a backpack full of these rocks up from the creek to my dad's truck. Along the way, I ran into a man that looked to be about 30 years old. We both appeared to be surprised that we would run into anyone in this rather remote section of the mountains. But as I got closer to this man, he was heading down to the creek as I was heading up to the road. He seemed to grow increasingly more startled. And at that point in my life, I remember very vividly not understanding why. He didn't say anything as I passed. He just stared, seemingly trying to figure out the appropriate words to ask me something. After passing him, I remember distinctly thinking to myself that after coming across someone randomly out here, that I was glad that it wasn't some mountain weirdo, that it was just a regular dude out here exploring, much like myself and my dad. I continued on my way back to the truck, dumped my load of rock off at the truck, and headed back down to the river to my dad. When I got down to the water, I told my dad about the encounter that I had and asked him if he'd seen this man, to which he replied that he hadn't. I've remembered this encounter quite vividly since then. Well, last year, I was visiting my family in Snohomish and decided to head up to Old Goblin Creek for nostalgic purposes. It had been about 15 years since I was last up there. Along the way, I found out that the Index Galima Road had apparently washed out years before. But luckily, I knew of another way up there, via Jack Pass. I found the dirt road and parked where my dad used to park, and proceeded to walk through the woods down to the creek. Along the way down, I saw something that absolutely shook me to my core. As I was about halfway through the woods, I was startled when I saw someone else coming up from the creek. It was a boy, about 14 years old if I had to guess. He was wearing a backpack, one that looked to be burdened by heavy weights. As we got closer, I began to get increasingly confused and shocked, as the boy looked exactly like I did at his age. I meant to say something to him as he passed, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out the right words to express what I was thinking at that very moment. He passed me and just kept going. I walked a little ways and finally stopped when it all really hit me. I remember the encounter from my teenage years and realized I had just lived the other half of the experience. Both the man and boy were me, roughly 15 years removed. I turned around in an attempt to catch up to the boy in the thick western Washington woods. I ran all the way back up to the road where my truck was, only to find nothing. There wasn't anywhere else besides the road for him to go, and I hadn't stalled so long as to not be able to catch up to him. He was just gone. That's when curiosity got the best of me, so I hurried down to the creek, half expecting to find my dad fishing on the bank 15 years younger, but found nobody. After all of this, I ended up going home and deciding that this experience was just too unbelievable to tell all my friends and family. I just wanted to get this out there to the wonderful community of internet strangers, to see what others think, and hopefully to see if anyone else has had this type of experience as well. I personally have never been a believer of the paranormal, glitches in the Matrix, or even sci-fi movies. That's at least in part why this experience is so mystifying to me. It leaves me wondering if it's not just the magic of nature out in those mountains, if there's something more unexplainable that resides there. The house that I live in is only a couple 100 meters away from a small church in a suburb. Although I was brought up a Christian, I was never truly religious, and I only went to said church whenever my parents took me as a kid. My dad died when I was a teenager, and we stopped going as a family altogether. After that, I only went whenever my friends asked me to tag along. Now I'm 21, and I only ever pass by the church whenever I have to go into the city, because there's a dirt road beside it that leads to the parking lot behind, adjacent to a major road where it was easy to get on a bus to work. It was closer than the village gate in the opposite direction, and I only had to ride one bus from there. I'm not an easily scared man, nor have I previously experienced lasting trauma after being spooked. And I'm here to tell you that what I saw beside that church 3 months ago still haunts me to my core. A storm had been announced to hit earlier that week, but leaving for work early that Thursday morning, the skies were clear. Not a single cloud to cover the starry sky, so I didn't think to bring an umbrella. I climbed over the parking lot gate because it was chained shut until 6 for the first mass. While there's a guard employed by the church, meant to be at an outpost nearby this fence, he often wasn't at his post, so it made it easy for me to get to my shortcut. I work at a hotel as a line cook, and it can be a very demanding job. I have to leave home before the sunrise, and most days I work long after it is set. The only time I get to see the sun is if I'm assigned to a station at the buffet, where we have a view of the poolside. It was an average, overworked and underpaid kind of day for me. I wasn't assigned at the buffet line. I stayed in the kitchen where there weren't any windows, so I was surprised to see the flooded streets once I clocked out. Apparently, it had been raining heavily all afternoon, and it subsided right around sunset. It was now around 8 in the evening when I left the hotel, and in my country, flooded streets meant standstill traffic for at least a couple of hours. This wasn't that uncommon. I had dealt with similar situations before. It also meant I could sleep on the bus, so it wasn't too upsetting. Fast forward to around midnight, and it's pouring again. I'm not too far off from the church parking lot, so I decided to get off the bus and start walking, because traffic had not budged for the last 10 minutes. I put my phone and wallet in my waterproof backpack, which also contained a spare shirt, my house key, and my set of knives. Around this time, the parking lot gate was already chained shut, but I climbed over like I typically do. It was flooded knee-deep in the parking lot, and there was no security at the outpost. Big surprise. I figured that he had retreated into the church. It's dark, but I focus on the small lights from the houses off in the distance. They only look like dots from that far away. I trudge my way through the open parking lot that could have passed as a kiddie pool when I hear this strange sloshing at the far corner to my left. Due to the heavy rain, I couldn't clearly make out what was there, but I knew that I wasn't alone. All the lights to the lot were off, and the only things to guide me were the few lights of the houses far ahead and my memory of the area's landscape. It's a straight shot from the dirt road, so I didn't really have to worry about a light source. The sound of all the falling raindrops accumulated into dull static noise, so it was easy for me to hear that there was something going on in that corner. I could see the shape of a person who seemed to be sitting down, so I could really only see them from the waist up. As I got closer, and my eyes better adjusted to the dark, I could tell that it was a woman because of the long hair and the outline of her body. She was flailing her arms and splashing the water around, grunting as she pounded her fists into the water. She was about 2 car lengths away, so I wasn't too concerned about it. I've dealt with crazy people before. I glanced over a few times as I passed her, and then got to the dirt road. Quite unnerving. She was out of my line of sight at this point, and the mud made it hard for me to walk. Water was only ankle deep, but I kept having to jerk my foot free after each step because my shoes would sink into the mud. A small splash made me look over my shoulder, and in the darkness of that dirt road, the woman was splayed out face first in the shallow water. I froze, thinking whether or not I should help her. I hated the thought of being the guy who let someone drown in water only 6 inches deep. She was about 10 steps away from me, and before I could decide what to do, she started to move. It was too dark to see any details, but her outline was distinguishable enough, just enough for me to see that she was looking up at me. She slowly got on her hands and feet, like she was about to stand, but her hands lingered on the ground, rump in the air. I was already scared pale at this point. My legs didn't work, and I thought of reaching for my knives, but I was afraid to move. That's when she starts crawling toward me on her hands and feet. This sends a jolt through me, and all of a sudden, I'm sprinting toward my house. I could hear the splashes behind me along with her coarse breathing, almost as if she was coughing. My eyes started filling with tears, and the rain against my face made the light in the distant houses blurry. But I knew that at that point, I was running for my life. I couldn't tell if she was catching up, but I didn't have it in me to look back. I heard her yell in a voice so rough, it resembled a pig squeal. Short, sharp, and loud. A wordless shout filled with anger. I believe that that was the fastest that I've ever run in my life. And at this point, I couldn't hear anything but the rain. Deafening, unrelenting, and violent. My house was close. I sped by a few other houses with their dim porch lights on, and I could tell that I was running on asphalt. I didn't know when it happened, but apparently I lost my shoes back at the dirt road. One last bend, and I was back at my doorstep. I forcefully ripped my backpack zipper open and fumbled around the inside for the key, frantically looking around to see if this woman was still chasing me. I got in the house, slammed the door shut, and collapsed in a heap. I don't really recall the rest of the night, but when I woke up the next morning in my bed, my older brother filled me in. He was awake when I got home that night and went to the front door when the noise alerted him. He said I was on my knees, leaning against the door and quietly sobbing. He woke my mom, and they did their best to console me, but I wouldn't talk. They tried to ask me questions, but I just shake my head. They got me into some dry clothes and led me to my bed. Over breakfast that morning, I explained to the best of my abilities what had happened, and my mom said that she'd notify the village guards. I could tell that they were concerned for my safety, but they didn't understand the fear that I felt. My brother even joked about it. I didn't go to work that day. In fact, I took the rest of the week off due to the fact that I caught a fever. The guards did a minor investigation and even increased patrols for a while, but they didn't find anything. Nothing except for my shoes in the parking lot. When I got better, I started taking the long walk to the main village gate to work. When I head home, I now carpool with a buddy who can get me close enough to home that I don't have to use the dirt road route. Days that he can't drive me, I take a taxi, even if it hurts my pocket a bit. I can't walk alone anymore, not without glancing over my shoulder every 5 seconds. Sudden loud noises make my heart jump, and I can't quite stand the sound of rain. I've been getting better though. I can sleep with the lights off now. I just wish I would stop seeing that crawling woman's shape whenever I start drifting off to sleep. I wish I could tell you more about her. I honestly do. Because it's one thing to be afraid of something, but when you lack the understanding of what it is you fear, your mind fills in all the blanks with absolutely terrifying detail. On a rainy night in the era before cell phones, I was 18, walking a very long way home from work, and I foolishly accepted a ride home from a strange man. Small town girl, living in her lonely world, and I had just gotten off of a double shift. He was elderly, acted genuinely concerned for me, and I saw a Bible in the backseat of his car. Probably safe, right? The car was old, beaten up, and he had to get out of the car to open the passenger side door for me. It took him a while, as he had trouble walking with a bum leg. He told me that the passenger door didn't open from the inside. I immediately felt weird at this admission, but years of nice girl training told me, he's gone to so much trouble. Don't say no. We chatted for a while, and he politely complimented me on my uniform my hair, and told me that I looked like his late wife, and that her spirit must have led him to help me get home. It sounded kind of sweet the way that he told it. The conversation turned to if I was still in school, what my hobbies were like, and gradually turned to whether or not I was on my period, which I found rude, but he acted like it was going to be the punchline of a joke, so I laughingly asked him why he would want to know. He said, very calmly, because if you're fertile, we should start trying for a family right away. Oh He said that God had kept him lonely for years, but now, because I looked so much like his late wife, it was clear I was meant to be his, so he could start life over again and finally have lots of children like his wife was unable to do. He grabbed my hand and kissed it and said, I can't wait to show you our new bed. The last few minutes with this man confirmed to me that this geezer was out of his mind. I told him I forgot something at work. He told me that I could get it tomorrow. I told him that I needed to pee, and he said that I could hold it until we got home. He wasn't going to let me out. He kept talking about how things were different back then, and how men are the head of the household, and that women are to follow their fathers, and then their husbands. And God says this, and God says that. He talked about his wedding day, how his wife's father had given her to him. So I blurted out, you're going to get my father's permission to marry me before taking me to your home, right? God would want that. You need to do that because otherwise we would be living in sin, and the marriage bed is not holy, which I remembered from my many, many days of church sermons. He got offended by this and said that he knew the Bible better than I did. And of course he knew to ask my father for permission. I told him that we couldn't live together in sin and we should just go to my house before going home. I then reminded him that the street wasn't far off. Still trying to keep the conversation light and joking, I told him that's what a godly man would do, and he wholeheartedly agreed. We then got to the street where I had previously told him that I lived. He asked which house was my parents'. I gave him a fake house number, far away from mine, and had him drop me there. He wanted to come inside, but I told him that I needed to let my parents know about God sending me a husband before he could meet them. I said it would take a few days. Come back tomorrow. He replied with, I'll give you a few minutes, but then we need to be on our way. I told him to drive around the block so I could have some time to pack my clothes. He nodded and finally opened the car door. I ran up to that random house's door, waved at him until he drove off, then sprinted off through the rain to my house, where I lived alone. I double bolted my door and put my couch in front of it that night. Never saw that guy again. I didn't call the police, though now I wish that I had. I moved in with my boyfriend a few days later, and I insisted on waiting at work until he could pick me up every night after. No more long walks in the dark for me. This story took place last November. It was cold, rainy, and around midnight. My fiancé and I like taking spontaneous late-night drives. We typically start out on one of the main roads within our city and keep following it until we hit the next town. Sometimes our drives last hours. The layout of my county and surrounding counties is a little bizarre. All of the cities and towns are isolated by large spreads of woods and country. I live in a relatively large college town, but a half-hour drive in one direction can land you stranded on jagged, unmarked gravel roads in the middle of nowhere, or in small, weird villages that no one really knows about. It's actually kind of exciting, and that's why we do it so much. So it's midnight, and we're nearly lost. Willa, my fiance, is poking around on my phone trying to figure out what road we're on. We're on a mud path in a pit of country framed by small towns that we've never heard of. Florey, Winnetka, and Tell, or something along those lines. There are no other cars on the road. It's rainy, foggy, and the headlights on my car aren't doing a damn thing. There are strands of trees and brush on either side of the road. We know that we're heading north. Willa tells me that she thinks we're going to cross W Street, which runs into Rye Road, which is a straight shot to Winnetka. We make our way down the mud road for a half hour, but never hit it. We've always had fun on these sorts of drives. This is the first time that we've ever really been on edge. Willa says that we should have found W Street already, and asks if we passed it without noticing. I ask her nervously in response if she thinks we should turn around, but she doesn't think we can without backing up into a tree or an unseen ditch. She's biting her nails while scrolling around on Google Maps. 10 minutes pass, and we finally see a little black road snaking up a hill, branching off of the road that we're on. I hurriedly turn onto it. It's very narrow, and twigs and branches are raking the doors and windows of the car. When we complete the climb up the little road, we find ourselves in a wide paved clearing with a house at the back of it, tucked up into the thick woods. Willa doesn't miss a beat before she starts hissing for me to turn around. Our headlights illuminate the whole property, which is in major disrepair. No lights, shattered windows, siding and shingles absolutely shredded. The yard is littered with scraps and trash. Barrels, car parts, tools, hundreds of glass bottles, slabs of concrete, rocks, and a nasty old Chevy pickup. It looks like the house is sitting on top of all of it. Every inch of the property is entangled in nets of ivy and weeds. Willa points out little moving shadows and glowing spots around the yard. It takes me a moment to realize that the glowing spots are cat's eyes. There are dozens of cats around, and they're all looking at us, their eyes glimmering in the headlights. I almost piss myself when a walnut-sized rock darts out of the brush and pops up against the windshield. Upon impact, it fractures the glass. Willa screams and grabs my arm. She's whimpering. "Denny, what was that? Oh my God, what was that, Den? What happened?" The rain is pouring in black streams down the trees, over the house, and across the pavement. All of the blood drains from my face, when, after a few seconds, a man stumbles out from the bushes, and he's carrying a fucking shovel. He's swallowed in a big, dirty navy coat, and has a long, unkempt beard. Then a screen door on the house flies open, and all the cats scatter. A tall, thin, spidery woman ambles out onto the porch. She has long, wild gray hair, and she's just up high enough on the porch that the headlights don't reach her eyes. She wipes her unusually dark hands on her skirt. I have no idea what was on her hands, but that's what I remember most about her. How dark her hands were. She's locked in staring at us. Willa is screaming, crying, and slapping the door lock repeatedly. I throw the car into reverse, rolling over cinder blocks and branches, and then screech back down the road. After Willa stops crying and there's some distance between us and the house, I start to relax. Yet, when we get out of the woods and hit a long stretch of straight road, I notice headlights behind us. I get a stomach ache when I notice that the car is mimicking all of our turns onto different roads. After nearly half an hour of being pursued, we finally reach Florey and pull into a gas station being visited by a few other people. I watch the vehicle pass. It's the same nasty Chevy truck that we saw at the house. They stalked us all the way to the next town. We wait till we see the truck disappear down the road before we get out, grab some food, and ask for directions. On our way home, I look at the rearview mirror more than I do the road ahead. And when we arrive back at home early in the morning, my teeth don't stop chattering until I fall asleep. While this was a wild occurrence, thankfully, we still have night road trips and run into really weird and cool things. We haven't encountered anything to top that creep sesh though. Since telling our families about it, we've been told to be a little more careful about where we go. We've also stored a knife in the glove box. I also keep my rosary in the car for now, in case, I'm dying and need to say a couple last Hail Marys. I've driven back around that area during the daytime recently. I even managed to find the mud road we were on, Country Road 90N. But I wasn't able to find the turnoff to get to that particular residence. I did get my windshield fixed, and Willa has since suggested that we have locations in mind when we go out on our night drives. That way, we're not driving around aimlessly. I have a few parting words of safety for anyone else out there that goes on night drives like we do. Stick to main roads unless you know that area well. If the weather is bad, avoid country roads. They can be swept away by flash floods, get icy, or can be blocked by snow. If you're driving at night, avoid leaving your vehicle unless you are in a well-lit location. Always keep your doors locked, even while on the move. In the country, it's common to run into people who don't have the best intentions. Trust your instincts. If someone is giving you bad vibes, get away. Don't roll down your window for anyone. And that extends to not stopping for anyone either. If anything should happen, your car breaks down, flat tire, wreck, while you're on a country road, call the police and don't get out of your car until they arrive. My sister got a flat on a country road and was approached by a whole lot of creepy guys. Don't worry about offending people. Just wait for the police and maintain your safety. Always have a spare tire, a full tank of gas, and a fully charged phone if you know you're going to be driving a lot, especially in weird places. Finally, don't honk excessively or be rude or an aggressive driver. People have gotten shot for much less driving around the country. In 2018, I moved into a small 2-story property in England with my then boyfriend. It was in a quiet cul-de-sac with houses crammed together, all facing one another. I'm pretty introverted and don't typically make a habit of socializing much with my neighbors. Still, we naturally ran into a few of them and exchanged pleasantries. As you would, right? One of our new neighbors, a man named Greg, was incredibly welcoming right off the bat. He was an older gentleman, the kind who'd stop you for a chat that would drag on and on until you made up an excuse for why you really had to get going. He shared local stories, asked about and took note of our birthdays, and even invited us around for a garden party where any and all were welcome. His house was directly across the street from where I lived, with his windows in clear view of mine. A couple of years passed by, and during this time, my boyfriend and I split up. Although I never expressly shared this news with any of my neighbors, word must have gotten around with his car missing from the driveway. He moved out and left the country, but we stayed in touch regularly as friends. Having the house to myself felt lonely, so I got a cat to keep me company. He quickly became, and still is, my world. Greg would often flag me down to talk when he caught me leaving or returning to my home. Annoying, but I could live with it. All the while, I'd update my ex about weird little interactions with Greg, which we both found amusing to gossip about. One such incident was when Greg came to my door to hand over 2 of my parcels, one of which was a large table that he had yet to retrieve from his house. I'd been raiding in Elder Scrolls Online at the time, doing a deathless speedrun for an achievement. Given the time constraint in my game, I told him I'd leave the door unlocked so that he could simply put the table by my door. I sat back down at my desk, put my headset back on, and my group charged in at the final boss. I heard my front door opening, followed by the sound of my large parcel being placed down. Then, footsteps approached me from behind. I looked over my shoulder to see Greg standing there, eyes fixed on me. For fear of disappointing my raid group, I continued playing until we killed the boss, and then removed my headset. Greg's face lit up, and he went on to tell me how amazing it was to watch me play. I got the impression he'd never seen someone use a keyboard, let alone play games. He begged me to teach him and rambled on. He was clearly intoxicated, so I just laughed it off and gave a non-committal response. Despite repeated attempts to politely make him leave, he was not to be persuaded. He seemed disappointed when I walked over to my door and opened it, clearly a signal that it was time to go. But he made his exit without further incident. In the UK, houses often have individual outdoor bins for trash, which have to be rolled out to the street the night before collections take place. Not sure how it is in the States. You're expected to bring back bins to your property after collection. I noticed someone kept bringing my bins back in for me. Was I blocking someone's car by being too slow to do it? Around that same time, I also noticed someone had been using my bins. I brought it up to Greg one time he pulled me over to talk, and he said the same thing had been happening to him. Maybe it was petty of me, but I decided to tape an old phone with a surveillance app to my window, overlooking the bins to figure out who it could be. Well, lo and behold, it was Greg. I chalked it up to him having run out of bin space after the local council moved from weekly to bi-weekly collections due to a staffing issue. Although it bothered me, my desire to avoid confrontation won out in the end. Christmas rolled around, and the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. One late evening, I heard a knock at my door and walked over to see who it was. I had no peephole, so I opened the door not knowing what to expect. Greg stood at my doorstep, which wasn't particularly unusual. I'd gotten all too used to his antics by this point. I immediately caught a strong waft of alcohol, but he spoke before I had time to process. He told me he had a Christmas present for me and handed over a red gift bag with colored tissue paper covering the contents. I'd really like to give you a kiss on the cheek, but I can't. Not with this pandemic going around, he said. That admission didn't come off as neighborly. It actually gave me a dose of the heebie-jeebies. So I did all I could to politely end this interaction and retreat back inside. He held me up by rambling on about God knows what. I firmly told him that I was busy and needed to go. That's when he laid a hand on my shoulder, leaned in, kissed my cheek anyway, and then walked off in the direction of his house. I closed the door and simply stood there for a few moments, in shock. The present was odd. Underneath the tissue paper were 2 bottles of Belgian beer, a can of half-eaten Pringles, sour cream and onion if I remember correctly, and a small plastic bag containing little chocolates. I recognized the latter item. A next-door neighbor with young children had come around to put these plastic bags with chocolate and a handwritten note, signed with their address, through everyone's mail slots a few weeks prior, a bit of a Christmas gift of their own. It was a sweet gesture, and probably something they came up with to keep the stir-crazy kids busy. Upon inspecting the regifted chocolates, I noticed he'd even forgotten to remove the note from the neighbor. The kiss plus the gift gave me bad vibes, and I immediately regretted accepting it. I decided that I was done being mispolite and resolved to be firm in my future rejections. On the second day of the new year, I was feeling lazy and ordered food delivery. A mere 5 minutes after receiving my food, there was a knock at the door. Knowing that the delivery driver hadn't forgotten anything, I concluded that this was likely to be Greg. Then it clicked for me. He'd often turn up immediately after anything was delivered to my door. He was constantly watching my house. Was he dumping trash in my bins as an excuse to hang around my home? He called out for me through the door. I felt too uncomfortable to answer and retreated upstairs out of view of the windows. Well, later that night, he came back and kept knocking, but once again, I ignored it in hopes of him going away. The following day, I contacted the police to file a harassment report. I felt sheepish doing so. I mean, was it really that bad? He was just a lonely old man, and I hadn't been firm enough. Upon being asked whether I wanted the police to speak with him, I told them that I'd do it myself. I just wanted the report on file, in case anything else were to happen. I would later become grateful for filing that very report. Greg turned up at my door a few days later, telling me how worried he was about me. I told him verbatim, "I think it's best if we don't have any contact going forward." His response was eerie. He seemed thoroughly put off and agitated when he said, "I just wanted to be your friend." I held my ground, cut the conversation short, and closed the door. Finally, it's over. At least I thought. A year went by without incident. Everything seemed fine, with no knocks on the door or unwanted conversations while I was outside. One night in winter, I was leaving my home to get groceries. It was completely dark outside by this point, save for a lamppost casting some sparse light onto the street. My driveway was at the side of my house, where the bins were stored. This driveway was blocked in by a tall panel fence to add some privacy, seeing as the kitchen window was directly next to it. You could see right into my kitchen and living room through this window. As I was outside locking the door, I saw a figure in the dark slinking out of my driveway and taking refuge behind the fence. I immediately unlocked the door and went back inside. It was dark. I could have imagined it, but my gut told me otherwise. Was there someone waiting for me behind the fence? Ultimately, I trusted my instincts and decided to forego the groceries for the night. I bought and mounted a motion sensor light to illuminate my driveway. The memory of the shadowy figure quickly faded, and the new light gave me some comfort that I'd at least be alerted if someone was lurking outside my window. A couple of months after the incident, I was in my kitchen getting some food for my beloved cat. The window was directly to my left, around 3 feet from where I stood. As I dumped the cat food into a bowl, I suddenly became aware of my motion sensor light being activated. I scanned the outside, not seeing anything, until my eye landed on something in the bottom corner of the window. I squinted, trying to make out what I was looking at. It somehow wasn't properly illuminated. I kept staring for what must have been 30 seconds. The light outside simply remained on, when suddenly, Greg pops up into view, directly outside my window. He'd been crouched down, peering in from the corner. Now, I'm normally someone who's cool as a cucumber. I rarely raise my voice or yell, but I truly lost it at that moment, screaming, "What are you doing?" repeatedly. But he just stood there before nonchalantly asking, "Are you all right?" I kept screaming, but now it was, "Why are you out there?" Without a response this time, he just walked off into the dark. I immediately called the police. Typically, the police in England leave something to be desired, but I have to give them credit for how they handled this situation. They took my statement over the phone and gave me a reference number. I received a couple of phone calls with updates and was told that they'd bring Greg to the station. I was also informed that he was known to the police for having previously followed young women. Sometime later, he was arrested at his property in front of a wife that I didn't even know existed. They did this to scare him, at least according to the officer that I spoke to make a point. Sadly, he received nothing more than a police caution, which forbade him from being on my side of the cul-de-sac or attempting to contact me. But still, it seemed to work. The window incident was the last real interaction that I ever had with Greg. I did happen to see him staring at me in the shower from his window one time when I forgot to close the blinds, but nothing else. I've since moved far away. I don't know then if it was common knowledge around the neighborhood, but I certainly hope it is now, that Greg is an absolute creep. I grew up in the typical Midwest suburb in the 90s, one where you and your family knew all the other families on your block. You'd invite them over for barbecues, and the situation was cordial, if not friendly. When I was about 12 or 13, my mom and dad owned a tow trucking company, one that did fairly well, and being that my parents were co-owners, this often meant busy days for both of them. The day where this story unfolds was one of their busy ones. They had gone to our neighboring state to assist in a massive pileup on the highway, so I had a few friends over at our house to hang out, and we were there alone. My friends arrived at about noon, and we were doing the normal preteen stuff, watching movies, eating junk food, talking trash about our school teachers. I remember that it was winter, so it started to get dark pretty early, and we were expecting my folks to get back no later than 6:30 or 7 p.m. Well, it couldn't have been much past 6 p.m. when there's a knock on my door. The way my house was set up, the front door was right next to my living room couch, where all of us girls were hanging out. My mom was known for kind of being stuck in the 80s. Big hair, certain expressions she wouldn't let go of, and she had this leather jacket that she wore 99% of the time. One of my friends, let's call her Tina, looks through the window on my door and says, "It's your mom. I can see your jacket." I jump up immediately because I'm not sure why my mom would be knocking at our front door. I look through the living room window, trying to see our front porch. It's already pretty dark at this point, and I don't see my father's tow truck, so I know something is off. I run to the front door screaming to Tina, "Don't answer the door. It's not my mom." But it was already too late. She opens the door and, in an instant, in storms this 6-foot-tall, 250-pound man with a black stocking over his face. He pushes Tina nearly across the room as he slams the door open with force. All my friends scatter, running from my living room to the kitchen, where our back door is located. They all make it and shove out into our backyard. Me, on the other hand, I learned that day that my fight, flight, or freeze is to freeze. This man grabs a hold of me and lifts me up in the air with ease. I was so scared that I actually peed my pants. I don't remember how it happened, but I managed to escape his grip. I run out the back door, down the block to a neighbor's house. We end up calling the cops, and within a couple of minutes, there were 6 police cars in our neighborhood, 3 on each end of the block. We all stayed at this neighbor's house, not sure what was going on, until my parents arrived and found their home being searched by police. It wasn't until later that more of the story would come out. The man that had forced his way into our home was a neighbor from 3 doors down. This was a man who had a family of his own, had spent time in our yard for a birthday party or two, even had my dad help him when he was having truck problems. To say that we knew him was kind of putting it lightly. Apparently, once he was found out, he told the police that he was just playing a trick on us, that he knocked on the door in an attempt to teach us to never open the door to a stranger. I agree that that's an important lesson, but not one for him to be trying to teach to a group of little girls that he wasn't the parent of. My parents pressed all the charges they could on this creep. He was arrested, held for a while before his family could make bail, and ultimately was found guilty for something like criminal trespassing, forcible entry, and the kicker, kidnapping, due to the fact that he restrained me in the process of his little trick. I don't think he did much jail time, to be honest, though, and while all of this was playing out, his family ended up moving away. I think the embarrassment of what the guy had done was too much for that family to bear if they stayed in the same neighborhood. That, or they couldn't afford to stay once he was locked up. I'm a full-grown adult now, nearing 33 years old as I share this, but I still can't quite shake this experience. Whenever there's a knock on my door now, I literally creep around my house so that whoever it is can't hear or see me, and I basically hide until they're gone. I doubt I'll ever run into this creep again, but I made a promise to myself years ago that if I ever do, I'm gonna punch him square in the dick. I lived in Japan for around 10 months a couple years back, as part of a study abroad program as my placement year for university. I lived in Hiroshima, and pretty much every Japanese person I met was exactly how you'd expect them: generous and respectful. All except this one old lady who just so happened to live in the apartment right next to me. It was about a month after I'd arrived in Japan. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, so it was quite an adjustment to make. This was when a group of our gaijins decided that we were going to go to the Saijo Sake Festival. For those who don't know, this is a huge rice wine drinking festival that, from what I now understand, everyone goes and gets extremely drunk at. As young men of fine taste and culture, we sampled many different kinds of sake from all over Japan, on our way to getting totally blitzed. From there, we all got back on our respective trains to head back home to our apartments. If I'm being honest, I don't remember much from that night, apart from calling my girlfriend at the time and passing out on my futon. Just normal stuff. Skip to 6 a.m. the next morning, when my loudest doorbell wakes me up. Keep in mind, my apartment is extremely small, so the noise is particularly loud. I check the time and am confused as anything, but assume that it's just my friend from downstairs who might want to talk about last night. I look through the peephole on my door and see a police officer standing there. The first thought that goes through my mind is, what did I do last night when I was drunk? But at the same time, I was so sure that I just fell asleep right away. I talk to the officer using a translation app, and he basically tells me that there's been a noise complaint. Strange, considering the fact that all I did was make a phone call and fall asleep. Anyway, the cop sees just how confused I am, and kinda sees that there must have been a mistake, before apologizing for the inconvenience and leaving. I'm honestly still a little drunk at that point, and more than a bit confused, but the day just carries on as normal. Well, the next morning, 6 a.m., doorbell rings again. I already kind of assumed what it was going to be this time, and what do I see through the peephole? 2 police officers. Same conversation goes down, and I convince them that there's been no noise. I literally walk them into my apartment to show them how I fell asleep watching Netflix. They tell me at this point that it's the neighbor, one who I've never met before, making these complaints. Now, I just think she's a bitch, or maybe a touch racist. I asked the guy at my uni who takes care of all the foreign students about this, and he tells me that I'm getting moved to an apartment on the floor below. I'm actually kind of pissed because I just settled into my new place, but whatever. He plans on coming tomorrow morning with the landlord to help move my stuff out and check to see if the new room is okay. That night, I went to sleep at a pretty good time, in preparation for the people helping to move my stuff out. So naturally, at 3 a.m., I'm fast asleep, when suddenly, my doorbell is now constantly ringing. It's fucking deafening. And of course, it's woken me up straight away. I can't even begin to tell you how scared I was. I couldn't even move, nor did I want to, when after about a minute of what felt like incessant noise, complete silence follows. I finally make my way over to the front door to look through the peephole, and I see nothing. But at this point, I know it's this psycho bitch neighbor. Nothing else happens in the wee hours of the morning, so I eventually get back to sleep. When I wake up, I'm still kind of shaken, but it's cool because my boys are coming around soon. I keep walking out the front to check if they're downstairs, and quickly closing my door behind me because I don't know what this woman will do if she sees me. I walk into my room and see that the sliding door to my balcony is open. This is weird to me because I don't use my balcony very much. I poke my head outside, and there, I see her for the first time. This woman, the next door neighbor, has literally wrapped her fucking body around the fence that separates our balconies from one another. She's got one foot on her side, but her entire upper body on mine. And she's staring right at me. We're locked in the staring contest for a second before she quickly whips back around onto her side of the balcony. From the moment she's out of sight, no more than 2 seconds pass when my doorbell rings. And I'm like, nah, that's not possible. This is some demon shit I'm up against. Thank God, it wasn't her at my door. In actuality, it turned out to be the people to help move my stuff. I tell them what's up and hastily begin the move downstairs to my new room. Outside of this woman turning up at my new room once and asking if the police had come, I was able to avoid her from then on out. My best guess is that the police decided to just start ignoring her calls. Not sure what this woman's issue was, but of all the things that I miss about being in the country of Japan, she's not one of them. Well, this event happened almost 20 years ago. I still remember every single detail about this encounter quite vividly. It was so random and so distinctly bizarre that I don't think I'll ever forget just what happened. Background: I'm about 20 years old at the time, and after visiting friends in college for the weekend, I found myself traveling home alone and taking the late train from Boston out to the suburbs where my car is parked. I'm running late and very concerned that I'm going to miss the last subway out of Boston. But gratefully, the train that I needed pulled up quickly. I remember being annoyed at myself for creating stress with such an unnecessarily close call, as I was definitely on either the very last or next to last train. And while I have friends I could stay with if I missed the train, I have to work in the morning, and my phone is now completely dead. The ride is long and slow, and there's hardly a soul on the train after we leave the immediate Boston area, which isn't very odd, seeing how it's Sunday after midnight. Halfway through the 45-minute ride, I doze off and jerk awake at hearing the blaring Braintree announcement, which happens to be my stop. In my foggy state, I grab my bag and jump off the train. When the moment I realize that I'm at the wrong stop, the doors close behind me. Turns out the announcement was just the train's destination, not that particular train stop. As you can imagine, I'm feeling pretty lousy about this, watching the train plod off in the direction that I needed to be going. I'm the only person to get off the train, and the station is unfamiliar and utterly deserted. Quickly, I realize that I'm in Quincy, 3 long stops away from my destination, and I'm feeling screwed. I really need there to be another train. I look around and realize I'm close to the end of a desolated and strikingly dark outdoor train platform. While the chances for there being another train so late are extremely slim, it's my only hope, and I begin to feel panicked, stupid, and vulnerable. After a minute or two of standing there dumbfounded and triple checking that my phone was actually dead, I suddenly spot a man standing alone under a light. Standing alone under a light, a distance down the long and thin platform. A little ways further beyond him appears to be the only entrance/exit for the station, unless there's some stairs going down into the terminal halfway down that I can't see. While the man makes me a little nervous, he's clearly facing the tracks, which gives me hope that one last train is on the way. I decide to just quietly sit on the bench close by and choose to stay unnoticed and in the dark while I wait. The bench is partially enclosed, and when I sit down on it, I'm basically obscured from the shoulders down by deep shadows, although I can still see in every direction except the one right behind me. A quick glance around, though, confirms that I'm definitely alone down here. So on the dark bench I sit and wait and feel comfortably obscured. With me wearing dark clothes and it being so dark at my end of the station, I have the opportunity to rather blatantly watch the man at the other end of the platform. The well-lit man is tall, thin, not old, 30s, maybe early 40s, slightly shaggy hair, and dressed casually preppy. He's strange though, standing abnormally still, looking straight ahead in a way that I just can't classify any other way than weird. Something's off, but he's minding his own business and probably doesn't even know I'm here. While I feel really uneasy, I do find some slight comfort in being certain that no one is down here with me, and I can openly watch the only other person from my dark, hidden bench. After watching for a few minutes, the man begins to rock a little, placing weight on one foot and then the other. He then takes a few slow steps towards the edge of the platform, and I notice that he's using a white and red walking cane, one reserved for the visually impaired, and tapping and feeling his way as he walked forward. Suddenly, I'm relieved, as this may explain his unusual posture. Just as I'm feeling more relaxed, that feeling vanishes. He's still walking towards the platform's edge, and quickly at that. I stiffen and sit straight up, looking intently. He makes it to the bright yellow raised metal warning tread that is at the very edge of the platform, one that's only a foot wide, and directly before an 8-foot drop onto electrified train tracks. He stops there, banging his cane against the edge, toes literally at the furthest point. I stand up and take a few paces closer as he starts to sway again, but this time more dramatically. My mind begins to race. What's going on? Is this some sort of suicide situation? He's in a lot of danger. I want to take action and try quickly to figure out the best way because this poor man obviously needs some kind of help. I'm just trying to figure out how to approach him because I really don't want to startle him with him being so very close to the edge. In fact, he's the furthest you can go, and his swaying has evolved to kind of a dance. Suddenly, after what seems like ages, but was likely no more than a minute or two, he stops and begins to take slow steps backwards, until finally he returns to standing still and staring straight ahead, back under that spotlight. With my heart racing and mind spinning, I return to my dark bench, sit back down quietly, and try to process what was happening. I still want to help this man, but now I'm being overwhelmed by alarms in my brain. I keep watching, and as silent as possible. He stands calmly for a few minutes under the light, facing the tracks, and safely several paces away from the edge. I decide to get help. I mean, he just did something unnerving, dangerous, and I don't know what his intentions are. I'm still sitting on my dark bench, fighting off conflicting feelings and secretly watching him, when he suddenly turns his whole body to directly face me, straight on facing me, exactly at the angle to where I'm sitting. And he's smiling. He's far away, but he's so well lit that I can tell. He's absolutely smiling and looking right at me. I'm startled by this, and my jaw drops. My mind is now racing like crazy. He knows I'm here? He must know I'm here. But if he knows that I'm here, why is he facing me? He knows where I'm sitting? Is he actually blind? But I'm sitting in the dark, not making a sound, and he's smiling at me. I freeze, solid. What happens next is so sudden that I remain basically frozen like a statue, sitting on the dark bench the entire time, not making even the slightest sound. Suddenly, and still smiling, he turns and faces the train tracks, and again using his cane, walks right over to the very edge and begins his side-to-side swaying. Except now it's even more dance-like. He then changes position, putting one foot right on the edge, and then one foot behind him, as he starts this exaggerated lunging motion, appearing to me as if he's pantomiming the action of jumping off a platform, but catching himself before he does. He does this repeatedly, and all the while I'm watching from a distance, basically in a state of horror and confusion, when suddenly he stops all of this and turns. This time, he doesn't face directly at me, but in my general direction, my end of the tracks, smiling still from all that I can see. That's when he slowly begins to walk down the platform towards me, and he's still walking right on the edge, directly on the warning track the whole time, and I can hear the clack of the cane going side to side. He's so close to the edge that the cane is going into the darkness. He gets closer and closer, and I can do nothing but stare at him. How could he be walking so close to the edge? Why is he coming down here? Closer and closer he gets, and I can now see him better. Still the big gaping grin on his face, empty and farcical, like a game show host. In his eyes, they're slammed shut. They aren't gently closed. They're aggressively and exaggeratedly closed, very, very tight. He's now no more than 20 feet away. I'm thinking that if I can hang on just one more minute, maybe he'll walk right by me, and with him out of the way, I can run and go get help. And maybe, just maybe, his facing me smiling was just a coincidence. Maybe this whole time he has no idea I'm even here. Maybe he really is blind. But greatly to my dismay, only about 10 feet before he reaches me, he stops, turns again, and faces me. Eyes still slammed shut, gaping smile across his face. This can't be possible, and I feel as if I'm in a surreal nightmare, when suddenly it gets much, much worse. He starts making this weird, high-pitched whimpering, moaning, feminine soft laugh. He reaches for the zipper on his pants, unzips them while holding his cane. He pulls down his trousers and underwear, exposing himself to me. Then, while still facing me, he begins jumping up and down, all the while continuing to do that same soft, coy laugh. He then changes position and starts doing that jumping from foot to foot lunging motion, like he's about to jump into the path of the train, except now his movement is compromised by his pulled down pants. He continues this, smiling, eyes shut, appendage flopping around this way and that, and making that same whimpering laugh. All the while I'm sitting there in some kind of mesmerized horror state. Suddenly, I hear the train rattling loud and approaching fast. In frozen horror, I'm both groveling in thanks to God and terrified that at the end of all of this true insanity, I'm about to see someone end it all right in front of me, or even accidentally get hit by the train. But right as the train reached the platform and began to slow down, he returns to simply swaying again and takes a step back. Being the very last train of the night, every car seems to have some people on it. I knew then that I was probably safe. The train stops, and I sprint like hell down the platform a few cars distance down before jumping on. I don't know if he gets on the train too or just stands there, but I definitely don't hear anyone yelling or anything like that, so I assume that he pulled up his pants either way. And so once on the train, I sink into the seat, mind thoroughly blown. My mind explodes in every single variation of the feeling that can basically be eloquently summed up as one giant, what the fuck? Gratefully, at the end of all this, I really do feel immediately safe, and I'm not further subjected to worrying about him following me off the train, even if he got on, because there's always other people getting off at Braintree. It was all just so odd and bizarre that I felt like after all these years, I needed to share it. It's easily the closest thing to a living nightmare that I've ever experienced. It was so weird, scary, surreal, and it happened in what felt like a flash. So much so that it was almost like I coasted cleanly by being scared before settling into a kind of hypnosis and being unable to move. I'm not trying to be dramatic about it. I just don't know how else to describe it. Honestly, when I got on the train, I was just sitting there a bit tweaked, wide-eyed, and really honestly laughing in my head about the sheer shock of it all. The immense feeling of relief that I felt when I boarded the train quickly changed any feelings of horror to that of shock, disbelief, and absolute gratitude. This story takes place when I was around 16, maybe 17 years old. I lived with just my dad in a small apartment in a questionable area. It was the type of place you'd not want to be out and about once the sun goes down. Up until a certain time, like 10, 11 p.m., there would be a cop or two in the area patrolling and making sure that there were no gang-related activities going on. I had a job at a restaurant in the city, which was about a 30-minute car ride and an hour and a half on the train. The train was a couple of blocks away from my place, and since my dad was always too lazy or hungover to drive me, that was my main form of transportation. I went to work around 3 p.m. and would usually get home around 12 or maybe 1 a.m. This was my schedule 4 days a week, aside from having school. I would see a lot of familiar faces on the train because of this, although we never really made conversation with each other. One night, when I got out of work extremely late, due to some assholes wanting to sit in the restaurant well past closing. Thanks to them, I missed my usual train. The next one wasn't scheduled to arrive for an hour or so. So, having nowhere to go and no money for Lyft or Uber, I sat there waiting. No one was around me, so when this older man showed up, kind of staggering a bit, I assumed that he was just another drunken hobo in the city, trying to catch a train to sleep in. Something about his face gave me the slightest feeling of deja vu, although I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I've just seen him on the train here and there. He made his way over to me, much to my discomfort, and started up a conversation. He wasn't slurring, but the way he was looking down at me gave me goosebumps. He asked me why I was out there so late, all by myself. I had to reply as to not anger him. I mean, we were all alone, and he was close enough to me to pull out a knife or something. Anyway, I told him I was waiting for the train, and he asked which one. Now, the train was color-coded with a strip at the top to indicate whether it goes north, south, east, or west. I took the blue line, but I lied and said that I took green. He looked at the schedule above the benches and saw that the green train was coming in 15 minutes. So he said that he'd keep me company. For those extremely long 15 minutes, he asked me how long I had been working at such and such restaurant. A question that would be innocuous almost any other time, but I had never told him where I worked. This made my blood run ice cold. I just looked at him and very timidly answered, "For a year." And he laughed. He said, "Wow, it's already been a whole year, huh?" At this point, my skin was itching out of anxiety, and as soon as the green train came, I knew I had no choice but to take it. I said goodbye to him and thanked him for the chat, hoping that that would be the end of it. Nope. He suddenly told me that he took the green train too. So he followed me on and sat in the seat directly behind me. My mind was racing about whether he was going to try to do something to me, like chloroform or hurt me in some other way. But we rode the train in silence. I was trying to figure out how I was going to lose him. There weren't many other people riding the train at this hour. Our car was empty, unfortunately. As the ride went on in menacing silence, I could feel him staring a hole in the back of my head. I waited until we got to a stop where there was another person visible, and I was so relieved to see a woman sitting there. She wasn't boarding this train, so I immediately got off and the man followed me, as expected. I took a seat on the bench next to her, close enough for her to see and hear everything that was going on, hoping with every ounce of me that she would catch on. The man noticed that I was sniffling due to allergies and being out in the cold, and he asked if I was sick. I told him no, but he insisted on giving me these weird pills he had that were supposedly cold medicine. I declined in a louder voice, saying, "Sorry, I don't accept pills from strangers." This prompted the lady to look at us, and I made eye contact with her. She knew now. Now this went on until a blue train came and the lady got up, giving me a look that told me to get on with her. So without any explanation, I did. She waved me over to sit next to her, and when the man tried to follow, she said, "No, you go sit over there," and made him sit a few rows down from us. He chose a seat where he could face us and stared at me the entire time. I felt myself shaking, about to burst into tears. The woman leaned over to me and whispered that everything was going to be fine, even acknowledging that she had a firearm on her. I felt much safer there with her. We whispered back and forth about what had happened. I told her where I lived and how I was worried that this man would try to follow me home. She told me that a friend of hers would be boarding the train soon, and when he did, she told me that his name was Ray. Ray was filled in about everything and agreed to escort me home. She promised me that I could trust him. The two of them waited with me until I got to my stop. The man, still watching me, started to smile widely, resembling the Cheshire Cat. He abruptly shouted, "This is your place, right?" To which I didn't respond and just gave the woman a hug and thanked her. Ray and I hurriedly hopped off the train. As I looked back, I saw that the woman had placed her body between the weird guy and the entrance of the train, holding her hand in her purse and urging the creep to sit back down. I finally allowed myself to cry in relief. Ray walked me home and tried to keep me calm by telling me about his job and his family. After watching me get inside the gates of my apartment, I thanked him profusely for his help. It chills me to think about how that night would have turned out differently if I hadn't met up with that woman and her friend. I feel extremely lucky even to this day. I never saw that creep again and eventually stopped thinking about him. But in the back of my head, that odd, aroused smile of his was burned into my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder just what else he knew about me. This all unfolded about 12 years ago. My ex and I were visiting England, and we ended up getting lost in a not-so-savory part of town, and it was quickly getting late. This was before Uber, and we couldn't even find a taxi cab. We decided to wait for the next train and ended up finding out from a nice homeless guy which train to take. However, we had a good 30-minute wait for the train. My ex decided that he had to use the restroom, so I stood outside the door while he used it. The station itself was nearly completely deserted, save for one single other person. At first, from afar, I couldn't decipher if this person was a man or a woman. However, upon closer inspection, it became clear that it was a woman, probably in her mid to late 40s, except she had that hard look about her. She was wearing men's combat boots, jeans that were tied with what looked like rope, and a man's flannel shirt. She was skinny, greasy hair under a knit cap, and she was a bit twitchy. My ex and I were used to seeing junkies, as we both grew up in California, and our home city had its fair share of tweakers. Anyway, she sat there occasionally mumbling to herself, but we did our best to not pay her any mind. Mostly we passed the time by playing with a deck of cards that I had in my purse. The train pulls up, and we get on. It's a pretty empty one, so we have our choice of seats. But of course, this woman sits right in front of us, even though there were rows and rows of others for her to choose from. We get comfy and settle in, as we have about 12 stops before we get off. Meanwhile, this woman turns to us and begins to cackle. She barely had any teeth, and the combination between that and our heavy Cockney accent made it pretty hard to understand. But she starts telling my ex that she would give him a proper jobby if he'd give her some money. Now, at the time, we weren't up on British slang, and both of us were like, "You'll give him a job?" My ex is telling her that he doesn't need the work. She's getting worked up, and the conductor tells her that she better quiet or he'll have to toss her off again. To this, she responds by muttering that he can f*** right off, before beginning other incoherent mumbling. It was hard to catch, but she called me a slag and some other not-so-nice names. Thankfully, we were back into the city proper, and our stop was coming up. We signaled to the conductor that we wanted off, and when the train pulled up to the stop, we got out. But so did our friend. My ex tells me that we should go grab some dinner, as we're both starving, and we begin to head for a pub not far from our hotel, one that we had seen the night before. The whole time, this woman is behind us. She starts taunting us, and I get a little worried, as obviously, sister is off her rocker. With a squeeze of a hand, my ex and I make a run for it, and we get lost in a crowd. We think that's the end of it, and head off to eat in the pub. We come out of the pub about an hour later, head up the block back towards our hotel, when all of a sudden, we hear, "That's them." We turn over our shoulder, and our friend, along with two other rough-looking characters, are coming up the sidewalk directly towards us. Once again, we book it, this time headed for our hotel, which, after a rich pub meal, isn't exactly the easiest feat. But luckily, once we get inside, the doorman stymies our pursuers and attempts to shoo them away. The two blokes that she was with immediately take the hint, but our friend continues to stare daggers at us through the glass windows into the hotel lobby. She doesn't say a word to us, just smiles that big, semi-toothless grin once more. I couldn't hear her through the door, but I'm sure there was another cackle attached to it. We didn't run into her again for the rest of the trip, thankfully. But I'd be lying to you if I said that the thought didn't pop into my mind more than a few times. This happened back in the summer of 2010, when I was just entering my teenage years. My family took a trip to a really nice hotel in the city. I can't really remember why we decided to take the trip, but I remember a lot of family friends coming with and staying in adjacent rooms. I've never asked my parents, and it's not truly too important to the story. To preface, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat, and always have been. I was a pretty skinny and fragile kid, so I got spooked pretty easily. I think that persists even now. This experience, however, was almost definitely not me freaking myself out like I normally did. Looking back, I'm incredibly lucky that I trusted my instincts. This hotel had a strange design to it. The lobby was actually on the 4th floor, not the ground level, which I found strange. To access the lobby, you had to use the elevator. There was no way for you to get to it from the stairs. This information would have been nice before everything happened, as you'll soon find out. The hotel was organized in a square shape. Every floor was lined with a balcony, and you could look down into the lobby and cafe area from your floor. Essentially, if you were walking to your room, you could be seen by anyone that was on your floor if they just stepped out of their room and looked around. I always was afraid to fall over the balcony and sail down 8 stories to my death. But the railings were high enough to a point where I wasn't too concerned for my safety. The first day or two were nice. My friends and I hung out and played cards all day, or we watched whatever was on TV. At night, we'd explore the halls of the hotel and tell each other ghost stories. It was a really fun time, even though I didn't fully understand why we were even there. On the third day, though, things got strange. I woke up to the sound of screaming coming from outside of my door. Now, because of the hotel's design that I mentioned, sounds from the lobby would echo all the way up to the top of the building. So when I walked outside to investigate, I immediately looked over the balcony to see what the commotion was all about. I saw a girl lying on the ground, eggs and milk splattered everywhere around her. People were rushing to assist her, and I heard a couple of people telling each other to call 911. It seemed as if the girl was unconscious. Maybe she had passed out or something. I scanned the lobby and saw that my family and a couple of my friends were down there getting breakfast, all staring at the event unfolding in front of them. I decided that I'd rush down to meet them to find out just what had happened. The elevator was on the opposite side of my floor, so I took the stairwell located right next to my room. We were on the 7th or 8th floor, so I knew I only had to take about 4 flights down. Not a big deal. I descended for a little while, looking for the number 4 on the wall or the letter L. I passed floor 5, ready to find a door to the lobby. I took about 2 more flights of steps before realizing that there hadn't been a door for the 4th floor, nor had there been a door for the 3rd or 2nd. Now at this point, I probably should have just turned back, but I continued down because I was tired and didn't want to climb back up all those stairs. There were some weird side hallways that went into pitch black areas with a bunch of piping and wiring, and though I was curious to explore, I passed them by. I quickly hit the bottom floor, a dimly lit and cold room with cinder block walls and concrete floors. In front of me was a set of double doors. I hesitated at first, but I assumed that this was just another way back to the lobby. So I opened them and entered. Behind the doors was a massive warehouse-type room, probably about the size of a high school's gymnasium. The only light coming in was from the stairwell behind me, so I really wasn't able to see much. Rollaway stairs were stacked and covered in plastic wrap. Tables lined the wall, and in the distance, I thought I could see boxes stacked and lined against the wall as well. I was probably in the storage room for the hotel. I looked around and saw an elevator in the back of the room, so I made my way towards it. I closed the door to the stairwell and began to walk in the dim light. The room was super muggy, dusty, and it seemed like nobody had been down here in a long time. As I got closer to the elevator, I noticed it was a little bigger than the elevators in the lobby. I pressed the up button, but got 0 response. There was a card swiper next to the button. Must have been for employees only, I thought. I turned back towards the stairwell doors, making my way past the chairs and tables along the wall. When I got to the door, I gave it a tug, only to find it locked. This is when things really started to hit me, and I realized I was now stuck in the dark, dusty basement of this hotel. I didn't have a cell phone because my parents wouldn't let me get one until I graduated middle school, so I couldn't call anyone for help. Everyone likely assumed I was still asleep in the room, so I began to freak out, believing that nobody was going to come looking for me. I searched around the warehouse, looking for other ways out. Some areas of the place were better lit than others, so I looked around in areas I could see first before starting on the darker side of the room. There was one other set of doors that I found, but those happened to be locked as well. I began to cry, scared that nobody would ever find me in this basement. I swear, it felt like hours, although as I think back, it was probably no more than a handful of minutes before I heard the door creak open. It wasn't the door from the stairwell, rather the second door that I had found. A slim, middle-aged man in a lab coat came out of the doors. Now, if this was 21-year-old me seeing this man, I would be very confused as to why this guy was wearing a lab coat in a hotel. But I was only 12 or 13 at the time, so I was immediately relieved at the sight of an adult, one who looked smart. I approached him, tears in my eyes, and he immediately looked surprised to see me, just as you'd expect. "What are you doing down here?" he yelled. "I got lost on my way to the lobby, and I've been locked in here. Do you have a key for the elevator?" I was shaking, eager to get out of there. He didn't answer my key question, and instead he said, "I know a way out of here. Follow me." He began to walk towards the doors with the stairwell, and I followed, relieved that someone had finally come to save me. We approached the doors, and I began to reach for the handle, but he continued walking. "Isn't it right here?" I asked. I'll never forget the look on his face when I said that. He looked nervous, and though the lighting was dim, I could see sweat glistening from his forehead and behind his glasses. "No, this way," he said sternly. I continued to follow him, but I was now nervous myself. We had passed the door to the stairs and were now headed toward a darker side of the basement, one away from the elevators. He looked like he had no clue where he was leading me, as he kept checking around him, almost as if he was taking in his surroundings for the very first time. We turned a corner and began walking towards the boxes. Another dead end. I immediately froze, realizing that something was very, very wrong here. This guy had no idea where he was going, nor did he even appear to work at the hotel. I said, my voice shaking, "Okay, where are we going then?" He turned and said, "This way. Just follow me." I knew that there were no doors by those boxes. I had checked there first, after I found out that the stairwell door was locked. I want to thank whatever God is up there for gifting me with the idea that I had next. I started yelling, as loud as I could. I yelled so loud that I gave myself a headache. The man, irritated and plugging his ears, began yelling back at me. "What are you doing? Be quiet." I continued to yell though. I don't even remember how long I was yelling for, when finally the man snapped and began quickly walking towards me. I went in a full sprint towards the stairwell doors, hoping with every ounce of me that they'd somehow be magically open. He didn't run after me. He walked sternly behind me, muttering things like "stupid kid" and all sorts of other kind of compliments. I was about 5 feet from the door when somebody burst through. My savior, a hotel janitor who had heard the screaming from the stairwell. He saw the situation, me and some random guy in a lab coat in a locked basement, and he immediately told me to get behind him. The janitor asked me who the man was. I told him that I had no idea, that he had come in through the door on the other side of the room, and I pointed to the door. The janitor quickly radioed into the desk that he had found a child in the basement, and quietly, so that I wouldn't hear, he said, "And a man that came from outside. Get security." The man in the lab coat started trying to argue with the janitor, claiming that he was simply looking for a bathroom, although the janitor clearly wasn't buying it, and kept saying things like, "Wait till security gets here. Talk to them about it." I was standing beside him the whole time, trying to take in everything that was happening, confused out of my mind though. Eventually, an employee from the front desk arrived and took me back up the steps to the lobby, where I met with my family, who, unsurprisingly, had no idea that I was even missing. I told them the story, crying and shaking, and they hugged me tightly, thanking the employee over and over for their help, although I never did get to thank that janitor. Looking back now, I have absolutely no clue what that man was doing in the basement. I don't have any information as to what happened afterwards, or who he even was. I know for a fact that the incident with the girl in the lobby was unrelated. Something about low blood sugar. Not sure. I've thought about that day a lot, and the only explanation I can put together is that the door that I found in the basement led to the streets of the city, where that man must have wandered in from. I have no clue what his intentions were, why he was wearing a lab coat, or why he chose to pretend that he knew a way out. To be frank, this could have been just a huge misunderstanding of some sort, and I just chose a really bad time to get lost. But all I know for sure is, if I hadn't screamed my lungs out when I did, I might not have been telling the story the same way, or at all. I worked as a flight attendant for a few years, back when I decided to take an extended sabbatical from college. There were a handful of let's not meet situations that I encountered, but one in particular still makes my skin crawl more than any other. I was born and raised in Texas, but had moved to New York when I was 21. So when I found out at the beginning of a week-long trip that I'd have a couple of overnights in Austin, I was super excited to go to my home state, even if just for a few days. My brother lived just north of the city, and we planned to hang out and go out to dinner the night that I arrived, once he got off of work. And the following day, we were going to meet up with our dad, who lived about an hour away. So I arrived at the hotel downtown. Both the crew and I check in, and then we each head off to our individual rooms. Short elevator ride, and I get to mine, where not even 5 minutes later, there's a loud, hard knock on the door. It was still early in the afternoon, and I hadn't called either my dad or my brother to let them know that I was in town yet, so they wouldn't know what room I was in. I assumed that maybe it was one of my crewmates, so I headed to the door. But before even making it down the short hallway, a loud male voice on the other side boomed. The front desk sent me about the bathroom problem you called in. Unlock the door and open up, miss. I need in. Now. I froze in my tracks. I hadn't even been in the bathroom yet, let alone called anything down to the front desk. I'm a petite chick, and while I take no shit from anyone despite my size, I still err on the side of caution. Slowly inching toward the door to look out the peephole, all I could tell was that the man on the other side was at least 6 feet tall and easily double my weight. No way in hell was I going to unlock the door for him. I responded to the guy, telling him that he must have the wrong room. He continued pounding on the door while constantly turning the handle. His only response was no, that he needed in, and that he was getting in the room one way or another. I panicked, but thankfully had the sense to grab the phone and call the front desk. The concierge confirmed that they had neither sent anyone up to my room, nor had they received a call about the bathroom. The entire time, this guy was still determined to get in the room, pounding and yelling. Lucky for me, the front desk had dispatched security to my floor immediately. When the security officer stepped off the elevator a few seconds later, I can hear them approaching from down the hall. They asked the guy who he was, what he was doing, and told him that he needed to leave the hotel. He in turn gets hostile and aggressive towards them. The front desk clerk that I'm still on the phone with tells me that the police have been called and are on their way. But in the meantime, I'm trapped in my room, scared shitless. Long story made just a tiny bit shorter, the cops show up pretty quickly and manage to arrest the guy for trespassing and criminal menacing, or something to that extent. I later found out that the guy was also wanted in connection to a string of break-ins and violent assaults in Austin. Apparently, he had seen me the moment that I walked into the hotel lobby and chose to stalk me the moment that he got the opportunity. Allegedly, I was exactly his type of victim. I think that we like to envision hotels as some kind of controlled environment where people who are inside these walls have a reason to be here, and that if someone is knocking on your door that it's likely with official hotel business. I'm glad that I had the sense to not blindly open that door and welcome whatever that man had planned. From the sounds of it all, I may have dodged something that could have likely been life-altering. I've been working for an independent hotel for just over 4 years now. We're the #1 rated hotel in our city, and proud of it. I mostly work in housekeeping, but have done some time at the front desk as well. I love my job, and I've always said that my bosses are great. Now, being a housekeeper, I've seen some things. I've seen a room where someone snuck in their dog, kitten, and chicken. Keep in mind that we don't allow pets. I once had a room that I was cleaning as a stayover that had tripods set up around the bed, professional camera equipment cases, an adult-sized pacifier, and XL-sized children's diapers. I even had a room once that we had to call the cops on for a raid because we found illicit substances inside. When the police arrived, they found a lot of drugs and guns in that room. But today is the first time that I've ever actually felt scared to be within a guest room. As I'm working on a room that's already been vacated, a man in the next room over catches me at my supply cart. He's said to be staying for several days and tells me, "You can go ahead and clean my room now. I'm headed down for breakfast." Excellent. I love getting my stayovers done early on. It makes things easier for the people working laundry the sooner that we get the dirty laundry down to them. So I pop over into his room, opening it up and propping the door open with a stopper like we always do. The first thing that I notice is that he has around 20 prescription bottles lined up on one of the 2 beds, along with several insulin bottles and needles. I'm nosy, I'll admit it, and I wanted to see what he was on. Oddly, it was only 2 different types of medication for all 20 bottles. About 2/3 of them were a diabetes medication, and the rest were a cholesterol medication. That's a little weird that he has so many bottles of the same meds, but whatever. I go to make the bed and see that some of the bedding has been stained. I sigh to myself, knowing now that I'll have to change all the bedding instead of just being able to turn down the sheets and blanket. So I leave the room, closing it behind me to go get the linens that I need, and then head right back. I prop the door open again and head to set the clean linens on the desk chair when I see out of the corner of my eye 2 notes sitting on the TV armoire. Normally, this wouldn't mean anything to me, except for this time, I caught the word "kill" scrawled on it. I dropped the linens in order to take a closer look. What I read on the first note still makes my blood run cold. "You don't have to forgive her. You just can't kill her. They're here to take money and alcohol away from you. Get over having to kill her, and you can safely leave." After reading this, my heart was pounding, and my eyes naturally floated over to the second note, which had just looked like a to-do list at first glance. But in the end, it made my stomach churn. Spray and wash. Apply for Medicare. Insubordination. The soul is healed by being with children. Bank card follow-up. Inheritance. Savings. Kauai. Population 10,500. Map, Montana. There will be a day of reckoning. Did you tell Mom what I said? How did Bev get my address? It was too much. I quickly snapped pictures of the notes on my phone so that I could show my boss why I wouldn't clean this room. I left the room quickly, closing it up behind me. When, just as the door closes, I turn and see the man just 10 feet away from me, returning to his room. My heart's in my throat at this point, but I manage to smile and tell him, I need more supplies. I'll be back to your room in a bit. I take off straight for the elevator, having noticed our maintenance man waiting for the slow transport. In a hushed tone, I tell him what I found, and he sees that I'm shaken, which isn't a normal state for me. He rides down with me, and I go straight to my boss and tell her that for the first time in all these years, I'm not comfortable being in a guest room. I show her the pictures, and her face goes still and pale. She heads to the front desk and asks our general manager for a minute of her time, and brings her back into the office to show her what I'd just taken on my phone. The general manager agreed this wasn't a safe situation, and she took our maintenance man with her to go inform the man that he had 1 hour to get his belongings and vacate the hotel. He would not be welcomed back. I spent a few minutes in the laundry room trying to calm myself down. Then my boss went back up with me to the floor until the man was officially out of the hotel. I don't know who Bev is. I don't know who the woman is that he didn't feel that he needed to forgive. But any time that I enter room 422, the thought of that man fills my mind.